It was a late October evening, the kind of night where the wind howls through the trees and the streets are slick with rain and everything seems just a little too quiet. I had just moved into a small two-story Victorian house on the outskirts of Philadelphia. The house had been empty for years, and I got it for an unbelievably low price because the previous owner had mysteriously disappeared. Friends warned me against buying it, saying old houses like that tend to carry secrets, but I didn't believe in ghosts. I had never experienced anything supernatural in my life, and I considered myself a realist. That night, however, I began to question every belief I had. I was unpacking boxes in the living room, my phone light barely illuminating the worn hardwood floors and the layers of dust covering the furniture. The house smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, and there was a chill in the air that the heater didn't seem to combat. I was so absorbed in arranging the kitchenware that I didn't notice the subtle shift in temperature until I felt a sudden, icy breeze pass through the room. I turned quickly, expecting a window to have been left open, but all the windows were closed and locked. Then I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps coming from the staircase. At first, I thought it might be the wind creaking the old wood, but the steps were deliberate, slow, and heavy. They came from upstairs and stopped abruptly, as if someone was listening. My heart started pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling slightly, though I tried to keep it calm. There was no answer. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously climbed the staircase. The floorboards groaned under my weight. When I reached the top, the hallway was empty. I checked each room. Empty. Nothing moved. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my stomach felt tight with anxiety. I decided to leave the upstairs for now and went into the kitchen to grab a cup of coffee, hoping the mundane action would ground me. As I poured the hot water into my mug, I heard a whisper, soft and faint, coming from the living room. "Leave." I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. My rational mind screamed that it must be the wind or my imagination, but the voice was clear, deliberate. I set the mug down slowly and called out, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, from the other end of the living room came the sound of something dragging along the floor, a soft scraping, slow, deliberate, heading toward me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted upstairs, locking myself in my bedroom. The air up there was frigid, so cold that I could see my breath. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm myself, but the fear didn't subside. Hours passed. I stayed awake, listening to the house. Every few minutes I would hear a whisper, sometimes from the hallway, sometimes from the ceiling, always the same word, "Leave." Occasionally, I would hear footsteps pacing outside my bedroom door, or a soft scratching at the walls. The heater made no sound, yet the temperature remained freezing, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally. By morning, the house appeared perfectly normal. The sun streamed through the windows, dust motes dancing in the light, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood, nothing more. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too much stress and too little sleep. But that night, the presence returned with a vengeance. This time I didn't hear just whispers. I saw movement. Shadows shifted on the walls, forming shapes that weren't there before. One corner of my bedroom darkened unnaturally, and I could make out a faint outline of a figure, tall, thin, almost translucent, but unmistakably human in shape. Its head tilted as it observed me silently. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my body was paralyzed with terror. The figure didn't speak, but I felt its intent. It was waiting, watching, a presence older than the house itself, as if it had been there long before I arrived. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving only the cold, oppressive air behind. Sleep became impossible. I couldn't stay in that bedroom, couldn't close my eyes without seeing the figure, without hearing the soft, insistent whisper, "Leave." I started sleeping on the couch in the living room, but even there I felt it. I would wake to find the blankets pulled off, furniture slightly rearranged, and shadows lingering in the corners. Every night, the activity escalated. Doors slammed without cause, windows rattled despite being closed, and the temperature would drop so low that condensation formed on the walls. I began researching the house, desperate for answers. I discovered that the previous owner, a woman named Eleanor, had vanished one rainy October night, decades ago. Neighbors remembered hearing screams and the sound of furniture being dragged across the floors, but when the police arrived, she was gone. The case went cold. Some claimed she had run away, others that she had met with foul play. But a few elderly neighbors whispered that her spirit never left, trapped in the house by whatever had ended her life. Armed with this knowledge, I tried to rationalize the events. Perhaps the house's old wiring and settling floors caused the noises. Perhaps the cold drafts and shadows were normal in a Victorian house. But logic couldn't explain the voice, the figure, the feeling of being watched. Logic couldn't explain why I felt a presence following me from room to room, why objects moved on their own, why the whispers persisted no matter how loudly I spoke. One particularly stormy night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I ran to the living room and saw the chandelier swaying violently, books from the shelves strewn across the floor, and the air shimmering as if charged with electricity. The whisper came again, louder this time, more urgent. Leave now. The figure materialized in front of me, taller and more solid than before. Its eyes, dark and hollow, fixed on mine. I couldn't move, couldn't think, only watch in horror. Then, without warning, it lunged, or at least I felt as if it lunged toward me, and I bolted. I ran down the stairs, out the front door, into the rain, and didn't stop until I reached my car parked down the street. The house loomed behind me, silent again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I had experienced something beyond explanation, something that wasn't just a story or a trick of the mind. I didn't return to the house for weeks. I stayed in motels, afraid to sleep, fearing that if I closed my eyes, I would see the figure again. When I finally returned to retrieve belongings, the house seemed ordinary in daylight. Yet as I touched the doorknob to leave, I felt it. The icy brush of air, the sense of being watched. The whisper, almost inaudible but unmistakable, followed me as I walked out. You cannot leave. Since then, I've moved multiple times, but the memory remains. Some nights I dream of the house, of the figure, of the whispers. The presence feels real even in sleep, and the word leave echoes in my mind. I've tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as a nightmare or anxiety, but I know what I experienced was real. Some spirits linger not out of anger or unfinished business, but out of habit, out of the sheer force of their presence. They wait for the living to intrude, to trespass, to acknowledge their existence. I have told a few close friends, but most dismiss it as imagination. I know better. I have seen, felt, and heard what cannot be explained. The figure, the whispers, the cold presence, they are all too real. And I understand now that some encounters with the supernatural are not fleeting. They leave a permanent mark, a lingering dread that nothing can erase. Even now, years later, on rainy nights or in old quiet houses, I feel that presence. It is patient, waiting, watching. It reminds me that some spirits do not rest, that some hauntings are not temporary, and that the boundary between the living and the dead can be disturbingly thin. Some lessons in fear are permanent, some warnings eternal, and some ghosts never leave, no matter how far you run. I have learned to heed the signs, the cold spots, the whispers, the shadows that move with intent. I never stay in unfamiliar old houses alone. I avoid empty streets after dark, and I listen to the quiet voices when they call. Because I know now that some spirits are not just memories. They are guardians, watchers, reminders that the world is larger and darker than we often care to admit. The nights of sleeplessness have never truly left me. Every time I close my eyes, every time I lie in bed, I feel the presence just beyond my vision, hear the faint whisper in the corner of my mind, leave. I have never ignored it, and I never will. Some encounters do not end, some presences do not fade, and some warnings are to be respected. That house, that figure, that voice, they have stayed with me, etched into my memory and my very soul, a reminder that the supernatural is not a story to be laughed at, but a reality to be feared and understood. And even now, when I tell this story, I feel it. The presence, patient and cold, reminding me of the night I understood the truth. Some spirits wait, they watch, they whisper, and they will not let you forget. Story, the end. The night it began wasn't particularly unusual, and that's what makes it so hard for me to explain even now. If there had been thunder, lightning, or some storm ripping through town, maybe I could convince myself my imagination had been tricked by the weather. But it was late October in a small Pennsylvania town, and the night was cold, calm, and quiet when I first realized something was off. I was staying over at my friend Daniel's house, which sat at the end of a long, winding road surrounded by woods. His parents were out of town for the weekend, so it was just the two of us, a couple of restless 20-year-olds with too much caffeine in our systems and no real desire to sleep. The house was an old colonial-style home, white paint peeling from the siding, with uneven floors and a furnace that clanked every time it kicked on. The kind of house that looked like it belonged on a postcard by day, but carried a different weight at night. I had stayed there plenty of times before, but never overnight when his parents were away. The stillness inside felt different, heavier somehow, like the walls were holding their breath. We had been playing video games until well past midnight, drinking sodas and laughing too loudly. By the time we decided to wind down, it was close to 2 in the morning. Daniel took the guest room upstairs, and I chose to crash on the living room couch. The cushions sagged, but I didn't care. I stretched out under an old quilt his mom kept folded over the armrest and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house groan and shift. That was when I started to hear it. Faint footsteps upstairs. At first, I thought it was Daniel, maybe walking to the bathroom, but the steps didn't stop. They moved back and forth, deliberate but slow, as if pacing. I sat up and listened harder. The sound of the steps wasn't muffled, the way they would be if it were Daniel moving around barefoot or in socks. They were heavier, almost dragging. I waited for a door to creak or the flush of the toilet, something to confirm what I was hearing, but it never came. Just steady steps across the floorboards. I almost called out to him, but something made me stop. Instead, I got up and climbed halfway up the stairs. The house was silent now. No footsteps, no movement. Just the sound of my own breathing. I told myself I was overtired and returned to the couch. But the moment I lay back down, the pacing began again. This time I knew it wasn't Daniel, because I heard his low snore coming from the guest room at the top of the stairs. The pacing was in the hallway outside his door. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I felt myself drifting, the sound started again. Sometimes it stopped right above me in the upstairs hallway. Other times it moved toward the staircase light, and I swear I could hear the faint creak of weight shifting on the top step, like whoever, or whatever, it was might come down. The next morning, I asked Daniel if he'd gotten up during the night. He shook his head. "I passed out right after lying down," he said. When I pressed, telling him I'd heard footsteps for hours, he gave me a strange look. "Yeah, this house does that," he said vaguely, brushing me off. "Old wood, pipes, whatever. Don't think about it too much." But it didn't feel like pipes, and it didn't feel like the groan of old wood. That day, we tried to laugh it off, but there was tension in the air neither of us acknowledged. We went out, spent most of the day avoiding the house. When night fell again, though, we couldn't avoid going back. His parents weren't due home until the following evening. I wasn't planning on staying another night, but when it got late and I realized I was too tired to drive, I reluctantly decided I'd sleep on the couch again. That night, I felt it watching me before anything even happened. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth. I was lying there, scrolling on my phone, when the air in the room seemed to thicken. My chest felt tight. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just beyond the edge of the light, right at the bottom of the staircase, waiting. Then, without warning, I heard the floorboards upstairs groan. The pacing began again, slow, heavy steps, dragging slightly with each movement. I froze, clutching the quilt, staring at the staircase. My ears strained for any other sound, but it was only that steady movement. After a while, it stopped again. But this time something new happened. From upstairs came a low creak of a door opening. Not slamming, just opening, inch by inch, and then silence. I knew all the doors upstairs were shut. I'd seen them when I went up earlier to brush my teeth. I could feel sweat prickling at the back of my neck. I almost bolted out the front door right then, but I stayed. I don't know why. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have drifted off despite the fear. When I woke, the quilt had slipped to the floor. At first, I thought nothing of it, until I noticed it was folded neatly beside the couch, as if someone had placed it there while I slept. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't done that. Daniel had been upstairs all night. I confronted him at breakfast. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "You're not the first person to say something like that." He admitted that his sister, when she used to live at home, would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of pacing in the hall. His mom once found her bedroom door wide open in the morning after swearing she had locked it. His dad had heard voices late at night. Dak low murmurs in the living room when everyone else was asleep. "They don't talk about it much," Daniel said. "But yeah, this place is weird." That evening I swore I'd leave before dark. But when Daniel asked me to stay, "One more night, man. Don't leave me here alone," I gave in. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself it was all in my head. It was the worst night yet. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to the sound of the pacing, but this time it was louder, closer, more urgent. The steps moved quickly up and down the hallway, almost angry. My heart hammered in my chest as I lay frozen under the quilt. And then I heard Daniel's voice, or at least I thought I did. He called my name from upstairs, low and strained. "Hey, come here." But something was wrong with the way it sounded, off somehow, like an imitation. My mouth went dry. I knew better than to answer, but my legs moved me toward the stairs before I even realized it. Halfway up, I stopped. The hallway above was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing, and then I heard it again, the same voice, just a little closer. "Come here." That broke me. I bolted down the stairs, grabbed my keys, and ran out the front door barefoot. The night air was freezing, but I didn't care. I sat in my car until the sky started to lighten. When I finally gathered the courage to go back inside, Daniel was standing in the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, holding a mug of coffee. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked. I told him what I'd heard. His face went pale. "I was asleep," he said. "I didn't call you." I never stayed at that house again. Daniel still lives there, though he swears the activity has gotten worse. Doors opening on their own, his dog growling at corners, the pacing every night without fail. He tells me he barely sleeps anymore. He's exhausted, worn thin, and sometimes late at night I'll get a text from him. "It's at my door again." I never know what to say back, because I can still hear that voice in my head, calling to me from the darkness. And I know if I had gone all the way up that night, something terrible would have happened. Something I can't even begin to imagine. But I also know this. Whatever is in that house doesn't just want to be heard. It wants to be obeyed, and it doesn't stop once it finds you. Even now, years later, I'll wake in the middle of the night in my own apartment and swear I hear the faint sound of pacing outside my bedroom door. And sometimes, just as I'm about to drift back to sleep, I hear it again, that voice, low and strained, calling me from the hallway. Story, the end. It was late October when I first noticed something was off in the house I had just moved into. I had found it online, a small 2-story home on the outskirts of a quiet town in upstate New York. The rent was cheap, and it was far enough from the city that I could have some peace while finishing my thesis for grad school. When I first stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of wood polish and something else I couldn't quite place, like dust mixed with dampness. I shrugged it off, telling myself, old houses have a smell. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent them unpacking, organizing, trying to get used to the creaks and groans of the old wooden floors. But soon the noises started. At first, they were subtle, a floorboard creaking where no one had stepped, the faint sound of shuffling upstairs when I was alone in the living room. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling. Then came the footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, pacing back and forth in the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze the first time I heard them, straining to listen, telling myself it was probably the wind or some animal outside. But as the nights went on, the footsteps became more distinct, more intentional. Sometimes they would start at the far end of the hall and move toward my bedroom door, stopping right outside. I began locking the door at night, even though I was home alone. One night, I woke at exactly 3:07 a.m. to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like two people speaking through a wall, their words indecipherable but urgent. My heart pounded, and I stayed perfectly still, hoping it would pass. But it didn't. It seemed to come from the living room, down the hall from my bedroom. Summoning all my courage, I got out of bed and slowly crept down the hall, the wooden floorboards groaning under my weight. I turned on the hallway light and peered into the living room. Empty. Not a single sign of anyone. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. I began losing sleep, staying awake long past midnight, waiting for the sounds to start. My friends noticed my pale complexion and the dark circles under my eyes, but when I tried to explain, I couldn't bring myself to say the words aloud. I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy. About 2 weeks later, I saw her. It was a Thursday night, and I had finally fallen asleep after a long day at the university library. I woke suddenly, a chill sweeping over me, and saw her standing in the corner of my room. A woman, pale as the moonlight streaming through the window, her hair long and dark, draped over her shoulders. She wore an old-fashioned nightgown, faded and tattered. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with empty, dark eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My body was frozen as the seconds stretched on, each heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, as quickly as she appeared, she vanished. I lay in bed shaking, unable to sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I tried to rationalize it. A dream, sleep paralysis, exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it was real. The appearances became more frequent after that. Sometimes she would stand at the foot of my bed, sometimes by the window. Once, I saw her reflected in the hallway mirror, though when I turned, the hallway was empty. The whispers returned as well, low and urgent, always indecipherable but unmistakably human. I began to dread nighttime, my anxiety building with each passing hour. I decided to investigate the history of the house. The town library had a small archive section, and after hours of searching old newspapers and property records, I learned that a woman named Margaret Holloway had lived in the house during the 1920s. She had been widowed young and reportedly died alone in her bedroom. Neighbors claimed she was seen wandering the halls at night, even after her death. Some said she had never left the house at all. The knowledge only made things worse. Knowing her name, knowing her story, made the experiences feel more concrete, more undeniable. I couldn't ignore the footsteps, the whispers, the fleeting glimpses of her pale figure in the corners of rooms. One particularly long night in late November, I woke to find the bedroom door slowly creaking open. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath visible in the icy air. I turned on the bedside lamp, but the corner of the room remained dark, as if the light refused to touch it. And there she was again, standing closer this time, her face partially visible. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, to flee, but my body wouldn't obey. I lay there, paralyzed, until finally, at the first light of dawn, she receded into the shadows and disappeared. I reached out to Richard, the landlord, desperate for some guidance. I expected him to dismiss me, but instead, his voice was quiet, hesitant. He admitted that other tenants had reported strange happenings, some leaving abruptly without explanation. He spoke of Margaret Holloway, confirming the stories I had found at the library. She doesn't like being alone, he said. People say she watches, waits, maybe even wants someone to stay with her. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed what I could and moved in with a friend temporarily, abandoning the lease, leaving behind most of my possessions. Even after moving, the experiences didn't entirely leave me. Sleep remained fitful, haunted by echoes of footsteps and whispers. In quiet moments when the world is still, I swear I hear her, just at the edge of hearing, a cold presence lingering, as if she's waiting for me to return. Years have passed since that first encounter, but the memory of those nights remains as vivid as ever. I've learned to cope with the sleeplessness, with the anxious waking moments in the dark. Yet every time I lie in bed, alone in a quiet room, I can't shake the feeling that someone is standing just beyond my vision, watching, waiting. It's a reminder that some presences don't leave, that some stories linger no matter how far you run. Even now, when I think about that house, I can remember the sound of the floorboards above my bedroom, the soft, indistinct whispers, the icy presence of her gaze, and sometimes late at night I feel a shadow brush against me, as if she's still there, still restless, still waiting for someone to stay with her. Story, the end. It started on a night, so still it felt wrong. I had moved into my new apartment in a small town in Ohio about a month prior. The place was an old building, built in the early 1900s, with hardwood floors, tall ceilings, and creaky doors that closed on their own. The rent was cheap, and I told myself that was a good enough reason to overlook the oddities. I'd always been a skeptic about ghosts, spirits, and anything supernatural, but that night would change everything. I had been working late at a local diner and didn't get home until around midnight. The streets were empty, the faint hum of a streetlight the only noise as I fumbled with my keys in the front door. The apartment smelled faintly of mildew, which I assumed was from being closed up all day. My dog, Max, a big German Shepherd mix, greeted me but seemed unusually tense. He paced in the living room, ears perked, and refused to settle by the time I started making coffee. I decided to relax on the couch, trying to unwind after a long shift. Around 12:30 a.m., I heard a soft knock on the bedroom door. At first, I ignored it, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, but then it came again. Rhythmic, slow, deliberate. Probably a neighbor, I told myself, though my apartment was on the top floor with no one above me. Max growled low in his throat, staring toward the hallway, hackles raised. I walked cautiously to the door, but when I opened it, nothing was there. Just the dark hallway stretching into the corner where the coat closet sat. The air felt heavier than usual, and I noticed a subtle drop in temperature. I called Max to follow me back to the living room, but he refused. He stayed near the bedroom, growling at something I couldn't see. Over the next few nights, the phenomena escalated. It started with small things. Doors I had locked would be open in the morning, objects misplaced, my keys ending up in odd spots. At first, I blamed myself, tired from work or Max for knocking things over. But then it became harder to ignore. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of whispers, unintelligible but clearly human. Sometimes they seemed to come from the living room, sometimes from the bedroom, sometimes both. One particularly restless night, I dozed off on the couch, exhausted from consecutive long shifts. Around 2 a.m., I woke with a start. The living room light was flickering, though I hadn't touched the switch. I sat up and noticed a shadow moving along the far wall. My heart pounded, but I rationalized it as a trick of the light. I tried to calm myself, telling Max everything was fine, but he didn't seem convinced. Then I heard it. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze. There was no one there. No. The apartment was empty. Max's growl deepened, but he didn't move. The footsteps approached, and with each step, the floorboards creaked, though I knew the apartment's old wood made a distinct sound that didn't match what I was hearing. I finally whispered, "Who's there?" No answer, only silence. Then a shadow appeared in the corner of my bedroom, just visible in the flickering light. It was vaguely humanoid, tall, and I could make out the outline of long hair. My stomach churned with fear, and I couldn't move. The shadow slowly shifted closer, and I felt a chill run through me that made my teeth chatter. The next morning, I considered calling the landlord, but I didn't know how to explain it. I told a coworker about it over coffee, half joking, half serious. She frowned and asked if I knew anything about the building's history. I didn't, but her expression suggested I should find out. I went to the local library that afternoon and searched through old newspapers and property records. The building, as it turned out, had a long history of mysterious occurrences. One tenant, a woman named Eleanor, had reportedly died in the apartment during the winter of 1924. She had been found in her bedroom, no signs of injury, but the coroner's report indicated she had likely died of exposure to the cold. Neighbors at the time claimed they often heard her singing softly at night, though she lived alone. A few other tenants had moved in and quickly moved out, citing strange noises and a feeling of being watched. Reading about Eleanor sent a chill down my spine. I remembered the shadow I had seen and the whispers at night. It was impossible, I told myself, but the pattern was unsettling. That night, determined to see if there was any rational explanation, I set up my phone to record video in the living room while I slept on the couch. Around 1:30 a.m., I woke to a faint humming. It was soft, melodic, and unmistakably a woman's voice. I froze, listening. The sound seemed to move around the room, echoing off the walls. Max whined softly, pressed against my side, ears flat. I turned on the flashlight on my phone, and that's when I saw it, a figure, barely visible, standing near the window. She wore a long dress, her hair hanging wet and tangled, and she was staring directly at me. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure tilted her head and slowly raised a hand, pointing toward the bedroom. I ran. I grabbed Max and bolted into my car, leaving the apartment unlocked. I drove to a 24-hour diner down the street and sat in a corner, trying to calm down. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment another night. I told the landlord I was moving out immediately. She didn't ask why, just nodded and said she understood. I didn't tell anyone else. Who would believe me? But even after moving into a new place, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Occasionally, I would hear Eleanor's hum, faint and distant, in the quiet of the night. Months later, I went back to the library, curious to see if I could learn more. I discovered an old diary in the archives belonging to Eleanor. She wrote about the isolation she felt, the long winters, and most chillingly about the presence she felt in her bedroom, especially at night. She described it as a shadow, tall and cold, that would appear in the corners and whisper in her ear. She ended her last entry with, "I fear it will never leave me, even in death." I realized then that what I had experienced was not unique. Eleanor had died almost a century ago, yet something remained in that apartment, waiting, perhaps hoping someone would notice. The fear, the cold presence, the whispers, it wasn't imagination. It was real. Even now, I avoid old buildings like that. I don't stay alone in places that have a history of tragedy. What I experienced wasn't a dream, wasn't fatigue. It was Eleanor, reaching out from a past trapped in that small apartment. I think about her often, especially when the nights are long and quiet. I still have the recordings from that night. The video shows nothing, just an empty room and Max staring at the corner where she stood. But the audio, her humming, is there, faint but unmistakable. I play it sometimes when I'm alone, not out of fear, but because it's the only connection I'll ever have to someone who couldn't find peace in life or death. Over time, I've learned to respect it. I never went back to that apartment, never tried to contact her again. But sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I can still hear the soft hum echoing in the quiet, reminding me that some presences never leave, that some nights are meant to be sleepless, and that some ghosts are real, not the product of imagination. It was the longest month of my life, moving from one place to another, constantly looking over my shoulder. But eventually, I found a small house outside of town. No neighbors for miles, just fields and forests, and Max finally relaxed. I thought I was safe, that the restless nights were over. But on one particularly quiet night, around 2 a.m., I woke to the faintest sound of humming again. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and Max growled softly at the corner of the living room. I turned on every light, checked every room, and found nothing. My rational mind told me it was a memory, that stress and fear were playing tricks on me. Yet I couldn't shake the chill creeping up my spine. Sometimes I think Eleanor's presence isn't limited to a single place. Sometimes I think she seeks out those who are aware, who can sense her longing and despair. I have come to accept that she will always be there, hovering just out of sight, her hum a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than most of us can comprehend. I never try to provoke it, never speak her name aloud. I sleep with lights on, Max at my side, and I avoid quiet, empty buildings. But even in the safety of my home, I occasionally hear it, a soft, melodic hum drifting through the air, a gentle reminder of a restless spirit who never truly left. It is a strange, lonely kind of fear, knowing that something exists beyond the veil of our understanding, something that cannot be reasoned with or explained away. It is a presence that defies time, one that lingers long after death, waiting for the living to notice. I learned that some nights are meant for sleeplessness, that some ghosts are not malevolent but persistent, and that some stories do not end because the spirits who tell them cannot rest. I have lived many years since that first encounter, yet I am careful now. I am careful with old buildings, with empty rooms, with shadows that move when no one is there. I do not speak of what I have experienced to most people. Disbelief is easier to face than ridicule. But at night, when all is quiet, I sometimes feel her presence again, near the edge of my vision, and I realize that sleep will not come so easily. It is a strange companionship, knowing that someone else is watching, someone who has seen more than I ever will, someone who has waited for decades for acknowledgement. I sometimes whisper back when I hear the hum, softly, as if to comfort her, as if to say, "I see you." And sometimes, just sometimes, the air feels lighter and Max rests his head, no longer tense, as if she has been temporarily satisfied. Even now, I know she is still out there lingering, a reminder that the past never truly leaves us, and that some nights are destined to be ghostly and sleepless. Story the end. It was a humid night in late August when I moved into my first apartment alone in upstate New York. The kind of humidity that clings to your skin, making you feel like the air itself is watching you. The building was old, brick with a faded red paint that had peeled in strips, revealing decades of neglect beneath. I had found the apartment online, a surprisingly cheap studio in a neighborhood that wasn't terrible, but wasn't particularly inviting either. I was 24, just out of college, and convinced myself I could handle living alone, even if it was in a place that smelled faintly of mildew and dust. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, arranged the sparse furniture I could afford, and tried to make the place feel like home. I even went out and bought a few small comforts, a lamp with a warm yellow glow, a cheap sound system, a thick blanket for the bed. Yet every night, as soon as I turned off the lights and tried to sleep, there was a feeling I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear at first, it was more like awareness. A whisper at the edges of my consciousness, something just out of sight. I dismissed it as nerves, moving into a new place and all. My first night alone, I lay in bed, scrolling through my phone until the early hours, feeling the occasional tickle of the air vent over my head. The air in the apartment was never still. It always hummed, moaned, or hissed as if the building itself was breathing. By the third night, the sense of being watched was unmistakable. I could feel eyes on me, following me when I moved from the kitchen to the bathroom. One night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. The apartment was unusually cold, a sudden drop that made my teeth chatter. I rubbed my arms trying to wake myself fully when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. My living room couch was across the small studio from my bed, but the shadows there seemed to twist, flicker. I froze, staring. Something dark, tall, and impossibly thin shifted just behind the couch. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the shadows, but the shape didn't move like a shadow. It moved against the light, like it had mass, presence. I blinked and it was gone. My heartbeat was loud, almost painfully so, as I sat up in bed. I told myself it was stress, imagination, a product of moving into an old building and staying up too late. I tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling lingered. Every night after that, things escalated. Doors I'd locked would be unlocked in the morning. The faint sound of whispers in the hallway, just low enough that I couldn't understand them, became almost constant. I even thought I saw figures at the windows across the street staring back at me when I peered out in the dead of night. Then the incidents started to get more personal. It began with objects moving. My coffee mug would be on the counter when I left it on the kitchen table. My keys would vanish from the dish where I always left them, only to reappear hours later in the bathroom. At first, it was subtle, but it gradually became impossible to ignore. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps pacing across the wooden floor of my apartment. I lived on the 3rd floor, so no one should have been able to walk through the walls above me. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, almost careful. They circled the room once, twice, and then stopped. I held my breath, convinced I would see someone standing in the doorway. Nothing. Sleep became a fragile, impossible thing. I would drift off for short bursts, only to wake in cold sweats, certain I had heard someone whisper my name. I began to dread nighttime. My friends told me it was paranoia, or stress, or maybe I wasn't eating enough. But I knew what I had seen, or at least what I had felt. Something was in that apartment with me, and it was patient. It reached a point where I didn't want to be alone even during the day. I started inviting friends over, needing the presence of other people to counteract the weight in the apartment. Sometimes they noticed things too, an odd chill that made their breath visible in the living room, or the feeling of being watched even though I insisted the windows were closed. One friend swore she saw a man standing near my kitchen doorway, but when she blinked, he was gone. I didn't want to believe her at first, but that night I caught him myself. I had been in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, when I glanced into the mirror and saw him behind me. A figure, thin, almost skeletal, with eyes that reflected nothing, just dark hollows. His presence was like a pressure in the room, suffocating and cold. I turned on the light quickly and the figure vanished, leaving only the faintest trace of dampness in the air. I ran out of the bathroom and stayed in the living room, light on, shaking, for hours. My friend's account was suddenly undeniable. He was real, or whatever he was. After that, I tried to research. I called the building management, asked about previous tenants. They were reluctant to speak, giving vague answers about people moving out suddenly or early. One elderly neighbor hinted that the apartment had a history, stories of a tenant who died under mysterious circumstances in the late 1970s, another who left suddenly, claiming the place was cursed. No one gave me specifics, but the implication was clear. This wasn't just an old apartment, it was something alive or haunted by what lived there before. The encounters became more aggressive. Objects were thrown when I wasn't looking. Books, lamps, even my blanket once. I would wake to the sensation of someone sitting on my bed, though the mattress showed no weight. On one particularly terrifying night, I woke to the sound of whispering directly in my ear, though no one was near me. The words were indistinct, but urgent, angry. I scrambled out of bed, light on, and saw the dark figure standing in the corner of my room, watching. I froze, too terrified to scream. He didn't move, didn't approach, but the feeling of being targeted, of being hunted within my own apartment, was overwhelming. I started keeping a recorder on my nightstand, hoping to capture some evidence. Over several nights, the tape recorded faint whispers, indistinct, almost melodic, and one night a low moan that didn't sound human. I played it back in the safety of daylight, and my stomach turned. The sound of someone or something breathing heavily in my apartment when I was alone, the whispering, repeating my name, the sense of presence that didn't leave even when the recorder was running, made me consider leaving. But I had no one to stay with immediately. My friends lived across the city. I couldn't just vanish without warning. I tried everything: burning sage, sprinkling salt, changing the layout of my furniture, leaving lights on at night. Nothing worked. The entity adapted. It became bolder. It started whispering even during the day. I would walk into my kitchen and hear a slow, deliberate exhale behind me. Shadows moved across my walls even when the sun shone through the windows. The air grew heavy and cold around me at random moments. It was always aware, always watching. Then the sleep deprivation started to affect me more severely. I began hallucinating during the day, seeing fleeting glimpses of the figure in the corner of rooms, in mirrors, even in the reflections of my windows when I was outside. The whispers followed me through the apartment, sometimes forming words I could almost understand, like warnings or threats. I became convinced that the entity wanted me to leave, but the thought of moving didn't seem safer. It had anchored itself to me somehow, and I could feel its presence wherever I went. One night, things escalated to a point I can't explain rationally. I was sitting in the living room, laptop on my lap, trying to distract myself with a movie, when the lights went out entirely. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. Absolute silence filled the apartment, pressing against my ears. I felt the cold first, then a presence behind me, heavy as if someone had leaned into my shoulder. I didn't dare turn around. I could hear breathing now, sharp, fast, controlled. Then came the whisper, "You can't leave." I bolted. I ran out of the apartment, leaving the door unlocked, keys on the counter. I stood on the stairwell landing, gasping for air, watching the apartment as if it would reach for me through the walls. The figure didn't appear, but the whisper lingered in my mind, in my blood, as though I had brought a part of it with me when I ran. I stayed with a friend for the next few nights, trying to convince myself it was all a product of stress, fatigue, imagination. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, always at the edge of my vision. I knew it had followed me. Eventually, I moved out of the apartment. I couldn't take it anymore. I left everything behind, gave up the lease, and rented a small room with roommates across town. It was safer, crowded, noisy. But I never felt entirely free. Every so often, late at night, when the world is quiet and my thoughts wander, I feel the cold, the watching, and I remember that apartment. I can't explain it rationally. I don't know if it was the spirit of a previous tenant, something born from the building itself, or something that latched on to me. But I know one thing: it was real, and it was patient. Even now, years later, I wake in the middle of the night, convinced I hear whispers just at the edge of perception, or shadows moving slightly out of the corner of my eye. I tell myself it's just memory, but deep down, I know some things never let go, and some presences never truly leave. The experience left a mark I can't erase. I avoid old buildings, abandoned places, and I never live alone for long. I sometimes wonder if it followed me, if part of it came with me when I fled. Sometimes I feel its presence in the quiet moments before sleep, a reminder that it exists, that it's patient, that it's waiting. And when I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the world outside, I realize I will never sleep without feeling eyes on me again. Story the end. It started the night I moved into the house on Maple Street. It was a small two-story home in a quiet suburb of Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where every lawn was meticulously kept and every house looked almost identical. I had just graduated from college and accepted a job in the city, and this was the first place I could afford on my own. I was proud of it, excited, and maybe a little naive about what it meant to live alone in a house that had its own history. The first few nights were normal enough. I unpacked my things, set up the living room and bedroom, and spent my evenings catching up on shows I had missed during the chaos of graduation. The house creaked at night, the usual settling sounds that old wooden floors make. I told myself that was just it, nothing more. I slept well enough, though sometimes I woke briefly, thinking I had heard someone moving around upstairs or in the hallway, only to find everything silent. Then came the third night. I had gone to bed around 11, exhausted from a long day of moving boxes and unpacking furniture. I was reading in bed when I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock coming from the living room below. My heart jumped. I paused, listening, hoping I had imagined it, but then it came again, a little louder, as if someone was rapping their knuckles on the wall or the wooden paneling of the stairway. I got up and crept to the top of the stairs, peering down. The living room was empty, the shadows long and shifting under the glow of the streetlight through the front windows. I called out, "Hello?" but no answer came. The knocking had stopped. I shook my head and convinced myself it was a neighbor, maybe a branch tapping the window, or the house settling. Still, sleep didn't come easy that night. The next evening, I started noticing small things. My keys were never where I left them. Sometimes my shoes would be slightly out of place. I chalked it up to moving in and being tired. But then I began hearing more distinct sounds. Soft footsteps upstairs when I was alone in the living room, faint whispers in the hallway, the creaking of the attic door as if someone had opened it and was standing there, listening. I never saw anyone, but the feeling of being watched was constant. One night, around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. I was awake enough to be certain. It was slow, deliberate, coming from the corner of my bedroom. I froze, heart hammering, staring at the shadows. Slowly a figure emerged, indistinct at first, then taller and darker as my eyes adjusted. I couldn't make out a face, just a shape that seemed too solid to be a trick of the light. I wanted to scream, to move, but I was paralyzed, every muscle locked in terror. Then it was gone. I don't know if it vanished or if I finally blinked and lost sight of it. I lay in bed shaking, trying to calm down. I turned on every light in the room and stayed awake for the rest of the night, too afraid to close my eyes. The incidents escalated quickly after that. Doors would open and close on their own, lights flickered, and I started hearing my name whispered when no one was around. The presence in the house became more aggressive, more deliberate. I would come home from work to find objects moved or broken or furniture slightly rearranged. Sometimes I could feel the weight of someone sitting on the bed when I came into the room, even though I lived alone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was stress, maybe it was exhaustion, maybe the old house had settling issues or a rodent problem that explained some noises. But deep down, I knew it was something else. One evening, I called a friend and asked him to come over. I needed proof, someone else to see what I was experiencing. He arrived late, and we stayed up talking in the living room. Around midnight, the room grew colder, the shadows thicker. He froze, looking past me, and whispered, "Do you see that?" I turned, and there, at the far end of the hallway, was a figure. Tall, thin, dressed in what looked like a long coat, face obscured in shadow. It wasn't moving like a person. It was more like a dark stain that shifted slowly, deliberately, watching us. My friend's eyes were wide with fear. I felt the weight of its gaze pressing down on us. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. After that night, I couldn't stay in the house alone. I began staying with friends, coming back only to grab essentials during the day. The house seemed to respond to my absence. Neighbors would mention strange noises late at night, lights turning on by themselves, doors slamming, but I never stayed long enough to witness it directly. The presence in the house had grown patient, silent, but I could feel it waiting, lingering, aware of my every move. I tried to get someone to investigate. I contacted a local paranormal group. They came in, set up cameras, motion sensors, and audio recorders. That first night, they captured a lot. Doors slamming with no wind, a chair moving across the floor, and faint whispers on the audio that sounded like someone calling my name. One of the investigators, a man in his 50s with decades of experience, told me the house was heavy with residual energy and that sometimes these spirits attached themselves to people, following them even if they moved away. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted a logical explanation. But every night alone, every shadow, every whisper told me differently. The worst moment came a few weeks later when I returned home alone for a day to grab some belongings I hadn't moved yet. I entered the living room and froze. The air was thick, cold, oppressive. The faint outline of a figure stood in the corner, its head tilted as if it were observing me, studying me. I tried to speak, to ask it what it wanted, but my voice failed. It moved closer, slowly, deliberately, its presence suffocating. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, before it retreated into the shadows and disappeared. I left that house immediately and never went back. I signed over the lease, moved across town, and tried to put the experience behind me. But even now, years later, when I am alone in a quiet room, I can feel it. The weight of being watched, the faint pressure on my chest, the whisper of a name I don't want to hear. I've learned that some places remember, that some presences don't rest, and that moving away doesn't always mean leaving. The house on Maple Street and whatever haunted it has left a mark on me I cannot erase. I never live alone anymore. I avoid old houses, and I never, ever stay in a quiet place at night without lights on. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake to hear the faintest whisper of my name, and I know that some things never let go, that some entities are patient beyond understanding, waiting for the sleepless to come back to them. Story, the end. It was late October when I moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of a small town in upstate New York. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and rumors travel faster than the autumn wind. I had just started a new job as a journalist for a local newspaper and needed a place to live that wouldn't eat up my entire paycheck. The house was cheap, almost suspiciously so, with its peeling paint, creaking porch, and a gate that groaned whenever the wind caught it. The real estate agent brushed off my concerns with a nervous laugh. "It's got character, just some drafts and old pipes. Nothing a little TLC can't fix." I should have listened to the first instinct in my gut, the one that whispered, "Don't do it." But I was young, ambitious, and desperate for independence. I signed the lease that afternoon. The first night was normal enough. I unpacked my boxes, set up my laptop, and made a pot of coffee. The house groaned in ways I thought were exaggerated until I heard the first clear creak of floorboards that didn't match the movement of my own steps. The house seemed to settle, but there was a rhythmic pattern that didn't fit. A slow, almost deliberate series of thuds coming from the second floor. I chalked it up to an old house doing old house things, though even then a cold knot of unease began to tighten in my stomach. By the third night, the unease had grown into outright fear. I woke up around 2 a.m., thirsty and needing to use the bathroom. The hall was pitch dark except for a faint glow from the street lamp outside, slicing across the patterned rug in a sliver of light. As I reached for the doorknob, I froze. From the staircase, I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps, slow and weighted, descending the stairs. My apartment was empty. I hadn't heard anyone else come in. I remember my heart hammering in my chest as I pressed my back against the wall, barely breathing. The footsteps reached the bottom, paused for a moment, then turned and went back upstairs. The next day, I told myself it was stress, maybe even a dream I had half awake. I tried to ignore it, but the footsteps persisted night after night, always around 2 a.m., always deliberate, always starting from the second floor. I started recording the sounds with my phone, hoping to catch it on camera or audio to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. When I played back the recording, it was unmistakable. Heavy steps, the faint scraping of furniture, and this part chilled me, a low, deliberate whisper. I could never make out the words, but it sounded like someone speaking my name. I asked my neighbors about the house. The old woman across the street squinted at me and said, "You're lucky it's just footsteps. Used to be a family lived there back in the 50s. Young couple, I think. Kid too. Something happened to him. Everyone left after that." She refused to elaborate, but I dug into the local archives and found an old newspaper clipping. A family of 3 had lived there, a man, his wife, and their 4-year-old daughter. One winter night, the father went out to chop firewood and never returned. The mother claimed she saw shadows moving in the house, whispering her name, but the police found nothing. By spring, she had vanished too, leaving the child behind, who was eventually taken in by distant relatives. The article hinted at strange occurrences in the house. Items moving on their own, doors slamming, whispers in the night, but no one had ever explained them. From then on, I couldn't sleep. Every night around 2 a.m., the footsteps would start. Sometimes it was just the steps. Other times, doors would slam, lights flickered, and I could feel a presence pressing down on me, a cold weight in the room. Once I woke up to the sound of a child giggling, faint and distant, right outside my bedroom door. I called out, thinking maybe a neighbor's kid had wandered over, but the hallway was empty. The laughter echoed off the walls, chilling me to my core. I started documenting everything, the sounds, the timings, the patterns. It became a morbid obsession. I even installed a small security camera in the hallway, hoping to capture something concrete. One morning, I woke up exhausted from a night of trying to fall asleep while listening to the stairs creak, and I checked the footage. At exactly 2 or 3 a.m., the video showed a faint silhouette at the top of the stairs. It was vague, almost like a shadow cast by the corner of the room, but the outline was unmistakably human, slumped, small, like a child. It moved slowly down the staircase, then stopped midway, and I saw the figure's head tilt as if listening. Then it vanished. I began hearing more than footsteps, whispers in the walls, murmurs beneath the floorboards. Once in the kitchen, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, a small figure crouching near the pantry. I spun around, but the kitchen was empty. Dishes rattled in the cabinets, silverware clattered to the floor. I was trembling by this point, sleep-deprived and terrified. I tried talking to it, reasoning, yelling, demanding it leave me alone. Nothing worked. It wasn't angry. It wasn't playful. It was watching, waiting, and somehow learning the patterns of my fear. One night, I was sitting in the living room, unable to sleep, wrapped in a blanket and staring at the staircase, when I felt a hand brush against my shoulder. I froze, knowing no one was in the house. I looked down and saw nothing, but the air had shifted. It smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic like old blood. The whispering started immediately after, circling my ears. I couldn't make out words, but there was urgency, almost panic, like a warning I couldn't comprehend. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and didn't leave until morning. Weeks went by like this. My work suffered. I called in sick, claiming illness, and spent my nights wide awake, sitting in the dark, listening to the house's every creak and groan. I couldn't bear to be alone with it. Friends came over, and the activity slowed or stopped entirely, but the moment they left, it would resume. The presence seemed to feed on my solitude, growing bolder, moving faster, whispering clearer. I began hearing my own name, repeated over and over in a low, childlike voice. I tried leaving, renting a hotel room for a few nights, but the nightmares followed me. Every dream was the house, the stairs, the whispers. I would wake up covered in sweat, heart racing, feeling as though someone had been standing over me, just breathing. One night, I dreamed of the little girl. She was standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale and eyes dark, staring straight at me. She whispered my name, then turned and ran upstairs. I woke up convinced she had really been there. Eventually, I sought help from a local historian who specialized in paranormal occurrences. He told me the house had a history of tragic deaths and disappearances dating back over a century. Several families had abandoned it after unexplained events. He explained that some entities, particularly those of children, could remain bound to a location if their deaths were violent or sudden. They don't always mean harm, he said. but they are confused, trapped, and they get curious. He suggested I try acknowledging the presence rather than confronting it aggressively. Leave offerings, speak calmly, maybe even ask it what it wanted. I was desperate enough to try anything. I left small toys on the staircase, a plate of cookies, even notes asking the little girl to leave me in peace. At first, it didn't work. The whispers continued, and the footsteps became louder, more deliberate. But gradually, something shifted. I began noticing patterns. The footsteps would stop when I acknowledged them verbally. The whispering would pause when I whispered back. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. One night, after leaving a small teddy bear at the base of the stairs, I heard a voice, clear and soft, almost shy. "Thank you." I froze, my heart nearly stopping. I whispered back, "Do you want me to leave?" There was a pause. Then the voice said, "I'm scared." My chest tightened. I realized then that this wasn't malicious. It was a frightened child, trapped between worlds, alone and misunderstood. I spent hours talking to the empty house that night, promising to keep her company, promising she wasn't alone anymore. After that, the activity changed. The footsteps became less frequent, the whispers less threatening. I would still hear her at night, sometimes calling my name softly, sometimes laughing faintly. But it was different. It was no longer fear that gripped me, but a strange companionship, a presence I had come to accept. I learned to coexist with the ghostly resident of my Victorian house. She never spoke much during the day, never appeared when guests were over, but at night, she was there, and I had made a silent truce. Years later, I moved out, taking a job in another state. I couldn't take the house with me, obviously, but I left notes, small toys, and drawings for her, hoping she would remember me. When I returned for a visit, the house was quiet, abandoned again, windows boarded. I didn't see her, but I felt a chill, a whisper on the wind that sounded like a thank you, faint but unmistakable. I realized that some things are not meant to leave the places they belong, and some spirits are never truly alone. They just wait for someone to see them. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, hear the faintest creak of stairs, and feel the presence beside my bed. Not threatening, not angry, but watching, waiting, reminding me of that sleepless, ghostly night where I learned the fine line between fear and understanding. Story the end. It was late October when I first moved into the old apartment building on the outskirts of Boston. I had just landed a job as a junior editor at a small publishing house, and the apartment was cheap, which suited my paycheck just fine. The building itself was a relic, built sometime in the 1920s, with faded brick walls and a narrow fire escape that creaked every time the wind blew. My friends warned me about living there, mentioning its history. A fire in the late 40s, a tenant who supposedly jumped to his death from the roof in the 70s, and rumors of unexplained happenings, but I laughed it off. Ghost stories never scared me, or so I thought. The first week went smoothly. The neighbors were quiet, the building seemed well-maintained despite its age, and the rent was affordable. I spent most evenings unpacking books and organizing my tiny kitchen. I remember the first night vividly. It was unusually chilly for early October. I had just finished dinner and was about to curl up on the couch with a book when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps coming from the apartment above mine. At first, I ignored it. Old buildings creak, I told myself. But the footsteps didn't sound random. They were slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth as if someone was measuring the distance between walls. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard something else. A soft whisper, barely audible, like someone muttering to themselves. I froze, listening. "Hello?" I called out, but the apartment above was empty, as far as I knew. The building manager had mentioned that apartment had been vacant for months. The whispering stopped. A heavy silence filled the room, and I laughed nervously, blaming my imagination. I told myself I was just stressed from work. I went to bed, leaving the lights on. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the old floorboards sounded like someone walking toward my door. I kept imagining a shadow moving across the ceiling. By the second week, the incidents had become harder to ignore. Doors would slam shut on their own, objects I had left on the counter were inexplicably moved, and sometimes I would wake up to the feeling of someone standing at the foot of my bed. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft humming, like a lullaby, coming from the living room. I was alone, or so I thought. One night around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly to a loud bang from the kitchen. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and flashlight, creeping toward the sound. The kitchen door was closed, and the light from my flashlight fell on nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw it. The refrigerator door was wide open, something I was certain I had closed before bed. I closed it and tried to convince myself it was just the old hinges. Then I heard the whisper again, this time right behind me. Leave. Now. I spun around, shining the light, but no one was there. My breath came in short gasps. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I was exhausted, but I told myself I just needed to get used to the quirks of an old apartment. A few nights later, I had my first real encounter. I was in the living room, working on my laptop, when I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath fogged up in front of me. The lights flickered, and the faint smell of smoke filled the room, like a fire had burned long ago. I looked up and saw her, a figure, semi-transparent, standing near the doorway. She was a woman in a long dress, her hair hanging loose, her eyes dark and hollow. I froze. She raised her hand, pointing at me, and whispered again, "You shouldn't be here." I bolted out of the apartment that night and didn't return until morning. When I did, everything seemed normal. The doors were closed, the lights worked, and the apartment felt warm. But the sense of being watched never left me. I tried to rationalize what I saw. Stress, sleep deprivation, maybe even a reflection of a shadow. As the weeks went by, the incidents escalated. I would wake up to find my bedroom door wide open, even though I always closed it. I would hear footsteps pacing in the hallway outside my door. The whispering became clearer, almost conversational, but always indirect, never fully understandable. I began to dread nighttime. Sometimes I would sit in the living room, lights on, waiting for sunrise, heart pounding with every creak and sigh of the old building. One evening, I returned home from work around 9 p.m. and found a note on my kitchen counter. It was written in red ink in a shaky, almost childlike hand. Go before it's too late. My hands shook as I held it. I had never seen anyone else in the building, and the apartment above was still vacant. I stuffed the note in my pocket and tried to act normal. I stayed awake all night, watching shadows stretch across the walls. By morning, the note was gone. I didn't know if I had imagined it. The most terrifying moment came about a month after I moved in. It was a Friday night, and I was trying to sleep despite the feeling of dread that had become constant. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of someone whispering my name. Soft, deliberate, almost a hiss. Daniel. My eyes darted around the room. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the streetlights outside. Then I felt it, a presence, cold and heavy, pressing against me as if trying to push me out of bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The figure appeared again, this time fully visible, standing at the foot of my bed. She was taller than before, her face pale and gaunt, eyes hollow but full of something I couldn't name. Anger, sadness, maybe hunger. She raised her hand, pointing toward the hallway. Leave before it's too late, she whispered. Then she vanished. I didn't sleep that night. I packed a bag and drove to my friend's house, staying there for the weekend. I thought maybe time away would help. But when I returned, things had changed. The apartment seemed alive in a way I couldn't describe. Shadows lingered longer than they should, and the whispering was louder, more insistent. It followed me from room to room. One night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I lit candles, grabbed a notebook, and sat in the living room, waiting. Around midnight, the temperature dropped drastically. The candles flickered and went out. The whispering started again, clearer than ever. You don't belong here. Then I saw her, the woman, standing in the corner of the room. She spoke, her voice echoing unnaturally. I died here, and now you will too. I backed away, heart pounding, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. She raised her hand, pointing at me. A shadow reached from her fingers toward me, dark and viscous, like smoke made of anger. I closed my eyes and screamed, hoping it would vanish. When I opened them, she was gone, but the shadow lingered, coiling around my legs, threatening to pull me down. I ran out of the apartment and didn't return until daylight. I stayed with friends for weeks, trying to find a rational explanation. But every attempt failed. People I told laughed nervously, suggested stress or overactive imagination, but I knew what I had experienced was real. Months passed, and I eventually moved out. I found another apartment, safer and newer, but the experience stayed with me. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear her whispering my name, faint but unmistakable. I've never been back to that building, and I never will. I learned that some places carry the weight of their pasts. The apartment building, with its decades of sorrow and tragedy, had left a mark, and I had walked right into it. The woman's presence wasn't malevolent in a traditional sense. She wasn't trying to harm me physically. She was trapped, angry, and desperate, and in some way, she had chosen to make sure anyone who came into her space understood it. People often ask me if I believe in ghosts now. I do. I don't know why she chose to reveal herself to me, or why the whispers followed me even after I left. But I do know that some nights, when I lie awake in a quiet room, I can still hear the faintest echo of her voice, soft and chilling, saying, "Leave, before it's too late." I've tried to share my experience with skeptics, scientists, and friends, but no one can explain what I saw. I've read about residual hauntings, about energy imprints left behind by violent deaths or tragedies, and perhaps that's what it was. Perhaps she was a remnant of pain and fear, replaying her final moments over and over. Or perhaps she was something else entirely, something that exists beyond our understanding. Even years later, I still think about that apartment. The creaking floorboards, the whispers, the sudden cold that made my bones ache, it's all vivid in my memory. Moving away didn't erase it, it just made it a story I carry with me. A story I know is real because I lived it. I've stopped renting old apartments. I avoid places with dark histories. I keep my lights on at night and sleep with a small recording of white noise to drown out the sounds I still imagine I hear. But sometimes when the wind howls outside, when a floorboard creaks or a shadow shifts in the corner of my eye, I remember her. I remember the woman who warned me, who whispered my name, who made me understand that some places are not meant to be lived in. And I remember the warning that has stayed with me more than anything else. Leave before it's too late. Story the end. It was a rainy October night in upstate New York when I first realized that some things don't belong in the world of the living. I was 24, living alone in a small rental house in a town I barely knew. The kind of place where the streets are lined with maples that drip amber leaves onto cracked sidewalks. I had taken the job at a local newspaper, hoping to get out of the city and into some quiet, manageable life. But that quiet turned out to be the kind that presses on your chest and whispers at you when no one is around. I moved into the house in late September. It was an old two-story with peeling white paint and a sagging porch, the kind of place that made real estate agents murmur about character and potential. The rent was cheap, which should have been my first warning. From the moment I unlocked the front door, I felt it, a subtle prickling awareness, like the house was watching me as I walked through it. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something else I couldn't identify, like faint perfume, but old, rancid, and clinging to the corners. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, set up my laptop on the small desk in the living room, and tried to convince myself that the house was just old and a little drafty. The locals I met in the diner and at the gas station were friendly, though they all gave me that same small, knowing smile whenever I mentioned where I lived. One woman even said, "Be careful in that house, honey. It can be lonely." I laughed it off. It was just small-town superstition. The first incident happened one night about a week after I moved in. I had stayed late at the office, finishing a story, and came home around 11. The rain had turned to a steady drizzle, tapping against the windows in a relentless, hypnotic rhythm. I set my keys down, kicked off my wet shoes, and flicked on the living room light. It was then I noticed the sound. Soft, deliberate footsteps upstairs. They weren't the creaky groans of the old wood settling, not exactly. They were precise, heavy enough to be a person walking slowly across the floor. I froze. "Hello?" I called, my voice catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped. I listened, holding my breath. The house was silent, except for the rain. I convinced myself it was my imagination, the stress of the day manifesting in phantom sounds. I went to bed, but sleep came reluctantly. Each drip of water from the eaves above the porch sounding like a ticking clock counting down to something I couldn't name. The next night it got worse. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the faint smell of perfume. The same old clinging scent I'd noticed when I moved in. It was sweet and metallic, like violets mixed with something rotten. I thought maybe someone had broken in, but nothing was missing. The windows were locked, doors secure. Then I saw her. She was standing at the foot of my bed, faintly illuminated by the streetlight spilling through the window. At first, I thought it was a reflection, a trick of the light. But she didn't move like a shadow. She was solid, pale, with dark hair that fell across her face. Her eyes were deep black pools, unblinking. She raised one hand slowly, just enough for me to see it tremble. I wanted to scream, but my throat was frozen. I blinked, and she was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning brought no comfort, just the same house, quiet and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. I started keeping a notebook beside my bed, writing down every strange sound, every shadow that didn't belong. Sometimes I'd wake to the faint sound of someone whispering my name. Sometimes the bed would feel suddenly cold, as if someone had lain down beside me and left before I woke. By the end of the first month, I was exhausted, living in a constant haze. The incidents became more frequent. I'd see her in the hallway when I turned the corner. I'd hear footsteps in the kitchen while I was in the living room. Doors that I knew I had locked would be slightly ajar in the morning. Once, I even found a message scrawled on my bathroom mirror in condensation: "Don't sleep." I had no idea how it got there. I lived alone and the windows had been shut. I started talking to people in town carefully about the house. Most laughed, thinking I was joking, but a few looked genuinely concerned. One man, an elderly retired firefighter, told me that the house had a history. Decades ago, a woman had died there. They didn't know exactly how, but rumors said she was murdered by someone she trusted. Her body had been found in the upstairs bedroom, my bedroom. No one had lived there for long after, and those who did often left abruptly, citing strange occurrences. I tried to rationalize it, thinking that knowing the story had made me hypersensitive. But one night, that rationality shattered. I was sitting on the couch, reading, when I heard a knock at the front door. It was soft, hesitant. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the rain had been too heavy for visitors. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. No one. Just the empty, wet street. I opened the door, peered out, and saw a single, pale handprint on the glass, as if someone had pressed their hand against it from the outside. But no one was there. From that point, the hauntings escalated. Objects began moving on their own. Books sliding from shelves, dishes tipping over, my keys vanishing and reappearing in odd places. I would hear whispers coming from the walls, and sometimes the whispers would speak words I didn't recognize, guttural and low. I started leaving lights on at night, trying to convince myself that the darkness was the problem. But it wasn't. The presence followed me, silent when I expected noise, and loud when I sought quiet. The worst incident happened one week in late November. I had returned home from a long day, exhausted, hoping for sleep. I walked into the house and immediately felt the air change. It was thick, heavy, and cold, like a storm trapped indoors. The faint smell of perfume was strong now, almost suffocating. I called out her name, voice trembling, but there was no answer, only the creaking of the old floorboards above me. I forced myself upstairs to my bedroom. The door was open, though I had left it shut. The room was darker than usual, the streetlight blocked by the thick clouds outside, and she was there, standing in the center of the room, staring at me. Her face was pale, contorted in a way that made my stomach churn. But it was her eyes, black, endless, that froze me in place. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Her voice was like wind through dead leaves. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. She raised her hand again, pointing toward the closet. I knew instinctively I shouldn't look, but curiosity overtook terror. Slowly, I turned my gaze. Inside, the closet was empty, but I could see faint scratches along the walls, claw marks that hadn't been there before. My heart pounded so loudly I thought she could hear it. Then she vanished. The room felt lighter, almost normal. I sat on the edge of my bed, shaking, unsure if I'd imagined the entire encounter. But then I noticed something new, a small, blackened photo on the floor. It was old, yellowed at the edges, depicting a woman standing in the same room, staring directly at the camera. The resemblance was uncanny. Her eyes black, her hair falling over her face. I couldn't breathe. I tried leaving. I packed my things, planning to stay at a motel, But every time I attempted to leave town, my car wouldn't start. Not once, not twice, but every single time. It was as if the house itself refused to let me go. I was trapped. Days turned into weeks, and I grew more desperate. I called a local priest, an older man who'd been living in the town for decades. He listened carefully, asked questions about the history, the smells, the sounds. Then he said something I will never forget. She's lonely. She doesn't know she's dead. She thinks this is her home still, and anyone who comes in is company. He offered to perform a blessing, a cleansing ritual, but warned me it might not work. Sometimes, he said, spirits attached to trauma don't leave so easily. That night, the house seemed even colder than usual. I could feel her presence everywhere, pressing in on me, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the living room, clutching a small crucifix the priest had given me, muttering prayers under my breath. Occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of her in the corner of my eye, vanishing when I looked directly at her. Weeks passed like that. I learned to live with it, though living is not exactly the right word. I became hyper-aware, always scanning, always listening. Friends stopped visiting because the house gave them the creeps. I stopped trying to leave. The car wouldn't start, and the road outside seemed to stretch endlessly in the rain and fog. I had become part of the house, a permanent resident alongside her. It wasn't always terrifying. Sometimes she would appear quietly, sitting in the corner, watching me without malice. Sometimes I would hear faint, wistful humming from the upstairs bedroom. I even started talking to her, softly, carefully, as if addressing a pet that didn't understand words but understood intention. She seemed to respond in small ways. A door left slightly open, a book placed on the table where I could see it. Then, one morning in early December, I woke to find a small bouquet of wildflowers on the kitchen table. They were fresh, not wilted, and somehow placed there without my knowledge. I didn't recognize the flowers, yellow and white, delicate, like something out of a forgotten garden. I realized, in a way that chilled me to the bone, that she was trying to communicate. I was not alone, not entirely, but I was not unwelcome. By the end of the year, I had adjusted to the rhythm of the house, the ebb and flow of her presence. I knew she wouldn't harm me. At least, I didn't think she would. I lived in a constant state of quiet vigilance, never fully sleeping, always alert to the sounds and shadows that filled the old house. And though the nights were long and sleepless, filled with footsteps, whispers, and that perfume that never faded, I understood that this was the way it had to be. She had her home, and I had mine, but the two homes were forever intertwined. Even now, as I write this, the house is quiet but aware. I can feel her presence behind me, just out of sight, waiting. The rain taps against the windows, and I know that tonight will be another ghostly and sleepless night, just like all the others. But I no longer fear her completely. She is part of the house, and I am part of it too. Perhaps that is the only way to survive living in a place where the living and the dead share the same walls. I don't know how long I'll stay. Maybe I'll leave one day. Maybe not. The car will probably start when it's time. Until then, I remain, sharing this space with her, listening to the whispers, watching the shadows, learning to breathe, and in a house that doesn't fully belong to the living. Some nights, when the wind howls through the trees outside, I swear I hear her laughter, soft and echoing, reminding me that even in fear, we are not alone. Story the end. It was a quiet August night when I first realized something was wrong with the apartment I had just moved into in Detroit. The building was old, a brick structure from the 1920s with a creaky iron fire escape and narrow hallways that smelled faintly of mildew and damp carpet. I had gotten a good deal on it, a small two-bedroom apartment with high ceilings and an old-fashioned charm, but I was alone for the first time in my life, and maybe that was the beginning of my problem. The first few nights were normal enough, if a little unsettling. Old buildings have noises, I told myself, floors that groan under their own weight, pipes that clatter when the water pressure changes, the occasional distant footsteps from neighbors. But on the third night, I woke to a soft knock at the door. It was around 2:13 a.m., a time when nothing should move or make a sound. I froze, listening. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. I told myself it was a neighbor, maybe a maintenance worker, though the apartment was completely isolated on that floor. When I got up to check, the hallway was empty. Nothing. Over the next few days, little things began happening. My keys would be in the kitchen when I was certain I left them on the counter. The lamp in the corner of my bedroom, which I never moved, seemed slightly angled differently each morning. At first, I laughed it off as absent-mindedness. But then came the shadows. I would catch them at the edge of my vision, shapes that seemed too deliberate to be just tricks of the light. One night, I woke to a whisper. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The word was indistinct, almost melodic, like it was trying not to be heard. I strained to catch it, and then it came again, clearer this time. My name. I sat up, heart racing, scanning the room. The apartment was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside the window. Everything was still, but I knew I wasn't alone. The following week, I called a friend and told him what was happening. He laughed, of course, said it was probably stress or lack of sleep, but he agreed to come over one night to prove it to me. We stayed up in the living room, talking and drinking coffee to stay awake. Around midnight, the air changed. It grew colder, denser, as if something had entered the room. My friend froze, looking past me, whispering, "Do you see that?" I turned slowly, and there, in the corner of the room, a figure emerged. Tall, thin, featureless in the darkness, but undeniably there. It didn't move like a person. It hovered slightly, almost swaying, but its gaze felt like it pierced through us. I felt a weight in my chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe, and then it was gone. Just like that, vanished into the shadows. My friend and I didn't speak for a few minutes, each trying to process what we had just seen. The events escalated after that night. Doors would open and close on their own. Lights flickered even when the bulbs were new. I started hearing footsteps in the hallway when I was alone. Objects moved. Once, I woke to my kitchen chair being tipped over. I had gone to bed at 10 and there was no one else in the apartment. The sense of being watched grew stronger each day. I would sit in the living room pretending to read, but I felt eyes on me, following me, observing. Sleep became impossible. I would lie awake for hours, sometimes all night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for whatever was in the apartment to make itself known. And it always did. Whispers, shadows, cold spots, sometimes all at once. Once I woke to the feeling of someone standing over my bed. I couldn't see them, but the weight was unmistakable, pressing down as if trying to pin me to the mattress. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly. After what felt like an eternity, it lifted, leaving me drenched in sweat, heart pounding. I started researching the building's history. I called the management company, tried to speak to neighbors. They were evasive, gave vague answers about people moving out suddenly or complaining about weird things. One older woman told me that someone had died in my apartment years ago, a man who had lived alone, just like me. The details were scarce, but she said the neighbors always heard strange noises and whispers late at night. That confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't just my imagination. I tried rational explanations, electrical issues, drafts, stress, but none of it accounted for what I was seeing. My friend, the one who had witnessed the figure with me, was a skeptic. He insisted it had to be a trick of the mind, a combination of stress and darkness. But then, one night, he stayed over again, and we were sitting in the living room when a cold wind swept through the apartment, even though all windows were closed. The sound of something heavy dragging across the floor came from the kitchen, and when we investigated, there was nothing there. But the feeling of being watched never left us. I decided to bring in professionals, a local paranormal investigation group. They set up cameras, motion sensors, audio recorders. That first night, the devices picked up strange sounds, whispers, heavy breathing, and faint knocks, all recorded when we knew the apartment was empty. On the monitors, faint shapes moved across rooms, shadows that weren't caused by the lights we had set. One of the investigators, a woman with decades of experience, said the house was active and that sometimes spirits linger in places where they had strong emotional ties, feeding on the energy of fear. Even after the investigation, I couldn't stay. I packed my belongings and moved across the city. But the experiences followed me. Sometimes when I'm alone in my new apartment, I feel a presence behind me. Shadows move just at the edge of my vision. Occasionally I hear my name whispered when no one is there. It's subtle, almost polite, but it reminds me that some things never let go, that some entities are patient beyond human understanding. The experience changed me. I don't live alone anymore. I avoid old buildings whenever possible. I keep lights on at night and always double check that doors are locked. But even now, years later, when I close my eyes at night, I can still feel the weight of those eyes watching me, waiting. And in the deepest part of my memory, I know that whatever haunted that apartment isn't gone. It is still out there, patient, waiting for the next sleepless night, the next unwary soul to occupy a place it calls home. Story the end. It was early November when I first moved into the small town of Millersville, Pennsylvania. I had taken a temporary position at the local historical society, cataloging old documents, letters, and photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s. My apartment was a modest second-floor unit above a small diner built in the 1920s, and while the building had an undeniable charm, there was something unsettling about it that I couldn't put my finger on. The floors creaked, the plumbing groaned, and the hallways smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic that I couldn't identify. I told myself it was just an old building settling into its age, but as the first night approached, I felt a knot of unease tighten in my chest. The first night was quiet, almost painfully so. I unpacked my things, made myself a cup of tea, and tried to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. Around 11 p.m., I heard it for the first time. A soft knocking coming from the apartment above mine. I assumed it was a neighbor moving furniture or some odd coincidence, but the sound continued at regular intervals, soft but deliberate, like someone tapping lightly on the floorboards. I tried to ignore it, but eventually curiosity got the better of me, and I went up to knock on the neighbor's door. The apartment was empty. I looked around, called out, and found no one. The landlord later told me that the previous tenant had moved out a week earlier and that the unit above mine had been vacant for months. Unease settled in my stomach. I tried to tell myself it was the building, perhaps the pipes or draft settling, but the knocking persisted that night and many nights after. A week into living there, the dreams started. They were vivid and terrifying, unlike anything I had experienced before. I would dream of the building collapsing around me, of shadowy figures standing at the end of the hallway, whispering my name in voices that were eerily familiar, yet impossibly old. Sometimes I would wake up to the sensation of someone breathing on my neck, only to find the apartment empty, the room cold despite the heat being on. I began keeping a journal, documenting every odd occurrence. Footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, doors opening and closing on their own, lights flickering in patterns that made no sense. On more than one occasion, I would wake up to find my apartment door slightly ajar, even though I was certain I had locked it. The final straw came one night around midnight, when I heard a child laughing, soft and high-pitched, echoing through the apartment. I live alone, and the building had been empty except for me. The laughter was followed by the unmistakable sound of small footsteps running across the floor above mine. I decided to investigate the building's history. At the Historical Society, I combed through old newspapers and property records, trying to piece together the story of the apartments. What I found made my stomach turn. In the 1930s, a young woman named Margaret lived in the same unit I occupied. She was known to be quiet and reclusive, but neighbors recalled hearing constant knocking, whispers, and the sound of a child crying or laughing when no children lived there. Margaret disappeared without explanation in 1937. Her body was never found, and the building was rumored to be haunted by her restless spirit. The information only made the nightly disturbances worse. Footsteps turned into shuffling, whispers turned into muttered sentences that I couldn't understand but sounded urgent. One night, I awoke to see a figure at the foot of my bed. A woman, her face pale and indistinct, wearing what looked like a faded dress from the 1930s. Her eyes were dark hollows, yet I could feel her gaze piercing me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She raised a finger and pointed toward the door, and as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. The apartment felt suffocating, the air thick with something I could not name. Desperate, I contacted a local paranormal investigator, a man named Paul Henderson. He had a reputation for being thorough and skeptical, but also for uncovering genuinely strange phenomena. He set up cameras and audio recorders, placing them in my apartment, the hallway, and the stairwell leading to the vacant apartment above. That night, around 2:15 a.m., the recordings captured what Paul described as a full-bodied apparition. A shadowy figure moved across the living room, paused, and then vanished. The audio recorded soft whispering, a voice saying, "Help me," over and over. Paul insisted on conducting a second visit. During his second visit, things escalated. The lights flickered violently, cameras malfunctioned, and we both heard a series of thuds coming from above, as if furniture were being dragged across the floor. Paul, normally calm and collected, admitted that he had never seen activity quite like this in his career. We agreed to document everything we could and consider involving a medium who had experience with spirits tied to tragic deaths. The medium, a woman named Evelyn, arrived a week later. She was quiet, professional, and immediately sensitive to the energy in my apartment. She walked through the room slowly, her hands hovering over surfaces, her eyes closing in concentration. "There is a presence here," she said finally. "A young woman, trapped, restless. She's not aggressive, but she's desperate for recognition, for acknowledgement. She relives her disappearance over and over, calling out for help that never came." Evelyn explained that spirits like Margaret's could remain tethered to places of trauma, replaying the moments leading up to their death or disappearance. "They are caught in a loop," she said. "They don't understand time as we do. Your presence here makes her aware, and she reaches out seeking connection." She guided me through a series of exercises meant to acknowledge her presence without provoking her. I was to speak to her calmly, leave small offerings, and avoid confrontational energy. The first night after Evelyn's guidance, I was terrified to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard the familiar soft knocks, footsteps, and whispering. I spoke aloud, my voice trembling. "I see you, Margaret. You are not alone. I hear you." The noises paused. The whispering stopped. The apartment felt lighter, though still charged with tension. Over the following nights, the interactions became more subtle. The footsteps slowed, the knocking became less frequent, and the whispering turned into faint, almost polite requests or acknowledgments. I began leaving small items: a note, a piece of bread, a glass of water. I didn't expect her to consume them, but I felt it was a gesture of recognition. One night, I awoke to find a small object I didn't own, a tarnished silver locket, on my nightstand. Inside was a faded photograph of a young girl, her eyes wide and staring. I realized that the child's laughter I had heard wasn't Margaret herself, but perhaps a fragment of her memory or a connection to her life before she disappeared. Months passed. The disturbances never fully disappeared, but they diminished significantly. I became accustomed to the subtle presence, a shadow in the corner of my vision, a whisper of my name in the hallway, the soft creak of stairs that were never occupied. I learned to coexist, to acknowledge without fear. Living with Margaret became a strange, uneasy companionship. I never felt threatened, only aware. She was a permanent echo of a tragic past, a reminder that some stories never truly end. Even now, years later, whenever I visit Millersville, I pass by that old apartment building. It stands quiet, paint peeling, windows fogged from decades of cold, and I think of Margaret, trapped in a loop between worlds. I sometimes feel a light brush of air, a whisper that almost carries words of thanks. Some nights, when the wind is right, I hear soft footsteps echoing from an empty hallway, and I smile faintly, remembering the sleepless nights where fear turned into understanding. There are things in this world we cannot explain, shadows that linger long after the people themselves are gone. I learned that fear often comes from misunderstanding, and that acknowledgement, no matter how small, can soothe even the most restless spirit. Margaret's presence is still there, and I know she always will be, but it no longer frightens me. I have come to accept it as part of the fabric of my nights, a reminder that some histories are alive in ways we cannot see, that some souls are never truly at rest, and that sometimes all they need is for someone to listen. Story the end. It was just after midnight when I first realized I wasn't going to get any sleep that night. The house was quiet, the neighborhood still, and yet there was a heaviness in the air that made my skin prickle. I had lived in that old rental house for just a few weeks, but it hadn't been long before I noticed something off about it. It wasn't the creaks in the floorboards or the way the pipes groaned when I turned on the hot water. It was the feeling, the undeniable sensation of being watched, especially at night. The house itself sat on a quiet street in upstate New York, not too far from the edge of town. It wasn't a big place. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room with mismatched wooden floors that had probably been refinished decades ago. It had character, the kind landlords like to pitch as charming. I had taken it because it was cheap and came with a backyard big enough for my dog, Daisy. I told myself I didn't care if the place looked like it had been frozen in the 1970s, with its yellowed wallpaper and a bathroom sink with handles that squeaked every time you turned them. But the first week in, I knew something wasn't right. Daisy, who had never been skittish, refused to sleep in the living room at night. She would growl softly at the empty hallway as if someone were standing there in the dark. At first, I brushed it off. Dogs hear things we don't, I thought. Maybe a neighbor walking late, or raccoons outside. But after a few nights of seeing her hair bristle along her spine as she stared into the dark, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. That particular night, I had gone to bed around 11, but by midnight I was still tossing and turning. The house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on your ears. I got up, poured myself a glass of water, and sat on the couch with Daisy at my feet. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. My breath caught in my throat. The problem was, there was no upstairs. The house was a single-story ranch. I froze, listening, my pulse racing. It wasn't the creak of settling wood or the random thump of pipes. It was deliberate, step, 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 slow and heavy like someone pacing across a floor that didn't exist. Daisy growled, low and rumbling, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. I told myself maybe it was coming from outside, maybe a raccoon on the roof or a branch scraping against it. But when I stepped outside with a flashlight, the roofline was bare, the night still. There wasn't even a breeze strong enough to shake the trees. The footsteps had stopped the moment I opened the door, but as soon as I came back inside, I felt it again, that crushing weight of being watched. I didn't sleep at all that night. I left the TV on, volume low, trying to fill the silence. Around 3 a.m., I dozed off, only to jolt awake a short while later to the sound of someone whispering my name. It wasn't loud, but it was so clear I snapped upright on the couch. The room was empty. Daisy whimpered, pressing against my leg, her ears flat against her head. The next morning, I convinced myself I had dreamed it. Sleep deprivation can do strange things. I tried to ignore the growing dread that seemed to thicken in the house each evening as the sun went down. But it didn't stop. One night, I heard knocking on the bedroom wall while I lay in bed. 3 slow knocks, spaced evenly apart. I held my breath, staring at the wall, waiting. Then again, 3 more knocks, a little louder this time. I turned on the light and searched the room. Nothing. Daisy wouldn't even come into the bedroom, no matter how much I coaxed her. She slept by the door, whining softly. I mentioned it casually to my landlord, half expecting her to laugh and dismiss it. Instead, her face went pale, and she muttered something about the house being old and noises being part of the charm. The way she avoided eye contact told me she knew more than she was willing to say, and it wasn't until about a week later that things got worse. I was lying in bed again, restless, when I felt the mattress dip beside me, as if someone had sat down. My stomach dropped. Daisy barked wildly from the other room, claws scratching against the floor as she refused to cross the threshold. I couldn't move. The weight on the mattress shifted as though whoever it was had leaned closer. The air grew cold enough to see my breath. I whispered, "Who's there?" My voice cracked. There was no reply, just a sudden pressure on my chest, like invisible hands pressing me down. I gasped, fighting to breathe, panic flooding me. Just as quickly as it came, it lifted. I bolted upright, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. Daisy barked once more before falling silent. The room felt empty again, but I couldn't shake the certainty that something had been in bed with me. From that night on, the activity escalated. Lights flickered even though the wiring had just been redone before I moved in. Doors creaked open on their own. I would wake up to find cabinet doors hanging wide open, even though I knew I had shut them. The worst part wasn't the physical disturbances, it was the dreams. Every night I dreamed of a woman standing at the foot of my bed. Her hair was wet, hanging in clumps around her face, her eyes hollow and black. She never spoke, but her presence was suffocating. I'd wake up with the echo of her dripping water still fresh in my ears. One morning, exhausted and terrified, I decided to dig into the house's history. At the library, I asked about old property records. The librarian gave me a sympathetic look before pulling out a dusty folder. That's when I found it. 30 years earlier, a young woman had lived in the house. Her name was Marlene. She had been found dead in the bathtub, drowned, though the coroner had never determined if it was accidental or something darker. Neighbors at the time claimed she had often complained of feeling like she wasn't alone in the house, that she heard voices at night. The details made my blood run cold. The bathroom in the report was the same one I used every morning. I couldn't stop thinking about her wet hair, about the dripping water in my dreams. That night, I locked myself in my bedroom and left the lamp on. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of water running. I stumbled to the bathroom, heart hammering, and found the faucet on full blast, steam rising as though someone had just taken a shower. My reflection in the mirror was fogged, blurred by condensation. Slowly, words began to appear in the misted glass as if written by an unseen hand. "Get out." I staggered back, tripping over the rug, and Daisy barked frantically from the hall. I couldn't breathe, my chest tight with terror. The words stayed on the mirror for several minutes before finally fading. I should have left that night, but I didn't. I told myself I couldn't afford to move again so soon. But the truth was, part of me wanted answers. I wanted to know why she was still there, why she wouldn't let the house rest. Over the next several nights, sleep became impossible. Every creak, every shadow set me on edge. Sometimes I'd hear humming from the bathroom, faint but unmistakable. Sometimes I'd feel a cold hand brush against my ankle as I lay in bed. The woman from my dreams began appearing when I was awake, too, out of the corner of my eye, reflected in darkened windows or standing at the end of the hallway. The breaking point came one stormy night in late October. The power had gone out, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a few candles and tried to calm myself, but the storm outside only made the atmosphere worse. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. This time, not from the ceiling, but from the hallway, moving closer to my bedroom door. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I forced myself to call out, my voice shaking. "Marlene?" Silence. Then the doorknob began to turn slowly, deliberately. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The door creaked open, and in the flickering candlelight, I saw her, a figure drenched, water dripping onto the floor, her eyes hollow pits of darkness. She stepped into the room, and with each step, the temperature dropped until I could see my breath billowing in the air. I scrambled backward onto the bed, clutching the blanket like it could protect me. She stopped at the foot of the bed, just like in my dreams. For the first time, she opened her mouth. A gurgling, watery voice rasped out, "It wasn't an accident." I couldn't respond. My throat closed in fear. She raised a hand, pointing at me, water streaming down her arm. "Leave, or you'll stay here with me." The candles blew out all at once, plunging me into darkness. I screamed, fumbling for my phone, the flashlight beam cutting through the black. The room was empty. The floor was dry. The door was closed. I left the house that night, didn't even pack a bag. I grabbed Daisy, got in the car, and drove until I reached a motel on the edge of town. I never went back to live there. I had the landlord send my things through a moving company. She didn't seem surprised when I told her I wouldn't return. Even now, years later, I still dream of her sometimes. I wake in the dead of night, convinced I hear dripping water in the silence. I never found out what really happened to Marlene, but I know one thing for certain. She's still there, in that house, waiting. Story the end. It was a late September evening when I first moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. I had recently graduated college, landed a job downtown, and decided I wanted a place that felt independent, somewhere I could finally live alone. The house was beautiful in a faded, almost haunted way. High ceilings, ornate wooden trim, and a massive fireplace that looked like it had belonged in another era. The landlord mentioned in passing that it had been built in 1892, and that the previous owners had left in a hurry, though he didn't explain why. I thought it was charming and historic. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The first few nights were quiet, if slightly unnerving. Old houses make noises, the creaking of wooden floors, the wind whistling through cracks in the window frames, pipes that clanged when the water pressure changed. I told myself that was all normal. I unpacked my things, tried to settle in, and even found myself appreciating the solitude. But on the third night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. I thought I had heard a whisper. It was so faint that I dismissed it at first, assuming it was the wind or my own imagination. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. That's when I heard it again, a soft, deliberate knock from the kitchen. I froze. The apartment was empty except for me. My first instinct was to convince myself it was the house settling, but the knock came again, more insistent this time. My heart raced as I climbed out of bed and slowly made my way down the hall. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside the window. Everything was in its place. No one was there. My hands were shaking as I returned to bed, telling myself I was just tired and overreacting. I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. The next few nights, I began noticing small things. Objects slightly moved from where I had left them, doors that I knew I had locked left ajar, and shadows in corners that seemed too deliberate to be caused by the dim streetlight outside. I tried rational explanations, forgetfulness, the wind, the house settling, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. By the end of the first week, I could feel it. A presence, silent and patient, watching me from the dark corners of the house. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. I live alone, and the sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps descending from the second floor. I stayed frozen in bed, trying to convince myself it was a neighbor or someone outside. But the windows were all closed, and the walls were solid. The steps continued, moving down the hall outside my bedroom door, and then abruptly, they stopped. I held my breath for what felt like hours until I finally gathered the courage to get up. Nothing. The hallway was empty, silent, but I could feel it. The air was colder, heavier, as though the presence had leaned close just to let me know it was there. By the second week, I couldn't sleep more than an hour at a time. Every creak, every whisper, every shadow made my heart race. I began keeping a notebook, writing down every strange occurrence. Objects moving, lights flickering, the sensation of being touched or watched. Sometimes I would see a figure out of the corner of my eye, a tall, thin shadow that never fully revealed itself. I would blink and it would vanish. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was stress, isolation, or imagination, but the occurrences became more aggressive. One night, around 1:30 a.m., I woke to a loud crash from the living room. I bolted upright, heart pounding. Something had knocked over the bookshelf I had spent the day arranging. I grabbed my phone and shined the light around the room. Everything was in disarray, books scattered across the floor, but there was no one there. That's when I heard it. A whisper, clear this time, right beside my ear. Leave. I spun around, but again, nothing. I could feel a cold presence in the room, a weight that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I called my friend Mark, desperate for someone to witness what I was experiencing. He was skeptical, but agreed to come over. We stayed up late in the living room, talking, trying to convince ourselves that there was a rational explanation. Around midnight, the air in the house changed. It grew colder, denser, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift toward us. Mark froze and whispered, "Do you see that?" I turned slowly, and there it was. A tall, thin figure standing in the corner of the room. Its face was obscured, but I felt its eyes on me, its attention focused entirely on us. It didn't move like a person, more like a shadow that had gained substance. I could feel its presence like a weight on my chest. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. We didn't speak for a while, too terrified to move. I realized then that rational explanations were no longer sufficient. Over the following weeks, the phenomena intensified. Doors would slam, lights would flicker, objects were thrown or knocked over, and whispers grew louder. I would wake to find chairs tipped over, the bathroom mirror smeared with condensation, though the room was dry, and once my bedspread was pulled off as if someone had been lying there. The presence became bolder, more deliberate. I could feel it watching me even in daylight, a sensation that made my skin crawl. I began researching the house's history. I called the city records office and spoke to some older neighbors. The house had a dark past. In the 1930s, a man who lived there alone was found dead in the living room under mysterious circumstances. No cause of death was ever determined, and the house had a series of short-term tenants over the years, many of whom moved out abruptly. Several neighbors mentioned hearing strange noises and seeing shadows moving in the windows late at night. I felt sick to my stomach, realizing that I might be living with whatever had haunted this place for decades. I tried everything to make it stop. Salt in the corners, burning sage, rearranging furniture, leaving lights on at night. Nothing worked. The presence adapted. It grew more aggressive. I started seeing fleeting glimpses of the figure during the day, shadows in mirrors, out of the corner of my eye. It whispered constantly, sometimes my name, sometimes words I couldn't understand, always urgent, always watching. My friends began to worry about me, urging me to leave the house. I wanted to, but I had nowhere else to go immediately, and I was trapped by my lease. One night, the experience escalated to something I cannot rationally explain. I was sitting on the couch trying to watch television when the lights suddenly went out. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. Complete silence filled the apartment. Then I felt it. The cold, the pressure, the presence of something solid behind me. I tried to turn around, but my body froze. I could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, close to my ear. A whisper, "You can't leave." I bolted upright and ran out of the apartment, leaving the door unlocked, keys on the counter. I didn't look back. I stayed with Mark for the next few nights, sleeping on his couch. I couldn't go back. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The dark, tall figure in the corners, the shadows stretching unnaturally. I could feel its presence lingering, patient, waiting. I realized then that leaving the apartment wasn't enough. Whatever had attached itself to that house might have attached itself to me. Eventually, I moved across town. I rented a small studio with a few roommates, hoping the presence would stay behind. For a while, it seemed safe. But even now, years later, when I am alone in a quiet room, I feel the weight of it. Shadows move at the edge of my vision. Whispers brush past my ears when no one is there, and sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, convinced I hear footsteps on the stairs outside my bedroom door. The experience changed me. I don't live alone anymore. I avoid old buildings. I keep lights on at night and always check that doors are locked. But deep down, I know that whatever haunted that Victorian house is still out there, patient, watching, waiting. And I know now that some presences never truly leave. They linger in the shadows, in the corners of your mind, in the spaces where you should feel safe, and they wait for the sleepless to return. Story, the end. It was late September when I moved into the old craftsman-style house on the edge of a small town in Connecticut. I had just finished graduate school and accepted a position as a history professor at the local college. The house was inexpensive, the kind of place that appealed to someone looking to live simply. It was a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, built in the early 1900s with original wood floors and an attic that smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. The previous owner, an elderly woman who had lived there for decades, sold it to me without much fuss. She did warn me that sometimes it feels like someone else is still living here, but I laughed it off, thinking she was just a little eccentric. The first week was uneventful. I spent my days unpacking, setting up my study, and exploring the surrounding neighborhood. The evenings were quiet, filled with the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. But the first night I slept there, I woke up at exactly 2:14 a.m. to the sound of footsteps creaking on the wooden floor above me. At first I thought I had imagined it, but the footsteps were deliberate, slow, and methodical, walking back and forth across the floor. I live alone. There was no one else in the house. I stayed frozen in bed, my heart hammering, listening as the steps stopped, then resumed in the opposite direction. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was the old house settling, but over the next few nights the pattern continued. Always around 2 a.m., the same slow steps on the upper floor, accompanied by faint whispers I couldn't make out. Sometimes I would hear the sound of a chair scraping the floor, as if someone were pulling it out or sitting down. The sounds weren't frightening at first, they were just wrong. They didn't match the rhythms of a living person. There was a certain hesitation, a rhythm that suggested something trying to imitate life but not quite succeeding. After a week, I started leaving small audio recorders throughout the house. I wanted proof, something tangible to rationalize the sounds I kept hearing. When I played back the recordings the next morning, my stomach dropped. The footsteps were there, slow and deliberate, but layered underneath them was a whispering voice. I could make out only fragments. Leave. Now. Don't sleep. My rational mind screamed that it had to be interference, a trick of the machines, but the clarity of the footsteps and the consistency of the timing made it impossible to dismiss. I decided to investigate the history of the house. At the town library, I dug through property records and old newspapers. The house had a long, dark history. In the 1920s, a family of 4 had lived there. The father was a businessman, the mother a homemaker, and they had 2 young children. One winter, a fire broke out on the second floor while the family was asleep. The father and mother died immediately, and the children were severely injured, one succumbing to smoke inhalation weeks later in the hospital. The youngest child survived but was removed from the house and sent to live with relatives. The home had been abandoned for months before someone bought it, and every owner after had reported strange noises, footsteps, and the sensation of being watched. The more I learned, the more the noises seemed to grow. The footsteps weren't just on the upper floor, they were everywhere. The sound of a child running across the hallways, a chair being dragged in the kitchen, drawers opening and closing. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering my name from the corner of the bedroom. I was paralyzed with fear, convinced I was hallucinating, but the air was cold, the kind of penetrating chill that old houses sometimes develop, but more intense, almost conscious. I attempted to confront it. I called out, "Who's there?" My voice echoed in the empty room. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed, faster this time, as if someone were agitated. The whispering grew louder, almost urgent. "Help! Me! Don't! Leave!" I froze, realizing that the sounds weren't meant to harm me. They were pleading. I began documenting everything: times, locations, intensity. I kept a journal, noting that the disturbances always started around 2 a.m. The voice was almost always female, sometimes childlike. I noticed patterns in the activity. It seemed the spirit wanted acknowledgement, recognition, and perhaps company. I left notes in the hallways, read small toys on the stairs, even a cup of water at the foot of the staircase leading to the second floor. Initially, nothing changed, but gradually the intensity of the disturbances lessened. The footsteps became less aggressive, the whispers softer. Then came the first clear apparition. I was awake in the living room, staring at the staircase, when I saw a faint figure at the top of the stairs. It was small, childlike, wearing a faded nightgown. Her hair was long and dark, partially obscuring her face. She stood there for a moment, looking at me, then slowly turned and walked toward the attic door, which had always been locked. I felt compelled to follow, my hands shaking as I approached the door. When I opened it, nothing was there, only darkness and the lingering chill of her presence. After that night, I began speaking to her directly, asking if she needed something, if she was Margaret, the name I had found in old records of the house's history. The footsteps would pause when I acknowledged her presence. The whispering would soften when I spoke aloud. I left small items for her, a ribbon, a small toy, even drawings I had made. One night, I woke to find a tarnished locket on my nightstand. Inside was a photograph of a little girl, her eyes wide and solemn. I realized then that she had been trying to communicate, to connect, for decades, trapped in the house and replaying the moments before her death. Months passed. The activity never fully disappeared, but it became manageable. I grew accustomed to the subtle presence, a shadow in the corner of my vision, a whisper that seemed like a warning or a thank you. I learned that she was not malicious, only restless, bound to the house by tragedy. The cold spots, the footsteps, the whispering, they were her way of asserting that she existed, that her story mattered. Friends who visited never saw anything, but sometimes they would remark on the feeling of being watched or the sudden drop in temperature. They never stayed past the first night. I didn't blame them. The experience was intense, isolating, and exhausting, yet there was a strange comfort in knowing that the spirit was not hostile, only longing for acknowledgement. Over time, I developed a routine. I would speak to her each night before bed, leave small items, and ensure that the house felt inhabited, cared for, and seen. The footsteps would sometimes continue, the whispers would occasionally rise, but the terror of the first nights had faded. I had learned to coexist with her presence, to respect it, and to acknowledge it without fear. Years later, when I eventually moved out for a new position at a university in another state, I left notes, small toys, and drawings behind, hoping that she would remember me and feel less alone. The house stood empty again, silent in the daylight, but alive with whispers and footsteps at night, just as it had always been. I realized that some spirits never truly leave. They linger in the places they were bound to, waiting for someone to see them, to hear them, to acknowledge their existence. Even now, years later, when I drive past old homes with peeling paint and cracked windows, I feel a familiar chill, a brush of air as if someone is standing just behind me. Sometimes I swear I hear a faint whisper of my name, soft and urgent, a reminder of that sleepless, ghostly night where I first understood the delicate balance between fear, empathy, and the unseen. Some histories are alive in ways we cannot see, and some souls remain tethered to the world, not out of malice, but out of the desperate need to be remembered. Story. The end. It was the kind of night that seemed ordinary at first. A late October evening in Pennsylvania, the kind where the air smelled faintly of wet leaves and the early chill hinted at winter's approach. I had recently moved into an old Victorian house on the outskirts of Lancaster, a place that had been vacant for years before I signed the lease. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families who had lived there for generations, hen and a few scattered young professionals like myself. I was thrilled about my new independence, though I didn't know much about the house's past. The realtor had been vague about it, saying only that it had character and that some previous owners left quickly, which I shrugged off at the time. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent them unpacking, arranging furniture, and watching late-night television. The house was beautiful in a worn, slightly decaying way, with ornate woodwork, tall ceilings, and creaking floors that gave it an antique charm. I noticed the creaks early on, but attributed them to the age of the house. It wasn't until the fourth night that I first felt the odd tension that would grow into something far more sinister. I had been in the kitchen making a cup of tea around midnight. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I had just poured the water when I heard a faint sound, like the scraping of a chair across the floor above me. I froze, thinking perhaps one of the previous tenants' items had shifted, but I was alone. I tried to shake it off as imagination, a trick of the house settling in the night, and went to my bedroom. As I lay in bed, I noticed the air felt different, heavier, colder than usual, like the room had swallowed the warmth of the day. I tried to read, thinking it would distract me, but my eyes kept darting to the corner of the room where shadows pooled unnaturally. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost inaudible, like someone exhaling right beside my ear. I sat up, heart racing, scanning the room. Nothing, just the moonlight spilling across the worn rug. I told myself it was stress, that moving into a new place could play tricks on the mind. I forced myself to sleep, though it was restless, filled with uneasy dreams of being watched. The next day, I mentioned it to my neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Callahan, who had lived in the area her entire life. I didn't want to seem crazy, so I downplayed it. "The house is old," I said. "It makes noises at night." She shook her head slowly, eyes distant. "Old houses have stories, dear," she said. "But some stories they're best left alone." I pressed, curious. "What do you mean?" She looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, and said, "This one, it wasn't a happy home for everyone who lived here. People left suddenly. Some say it's unsettled." She didn't elaborate, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I tried to forget it, dismissing her words as superstition. The second week was when the activity escalated. It started with small things. Doors that were closed when I knew I had left them open, lights flickering for no reason, and the occasional cold spot in the hallway. At first, I rationalized everything. The electrical system was old. Drafts from the windows were natural. But the occurrences became harder to ignore. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. They weren't the slow, creaking kind of the house settling. These were deliberate, heavy steps coming from the landing outside my bedroom. I froze, holding my breath, listening as the steps paused, then continued down the hallway, fading into silence. My door was closed and locked, yet the sound had been unmistakably right outside. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night, listening for more sounds that never came. A few days later, I woke to a faint scratching at my bedroom door. The sound was slow, deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood. I called out, thinking perhaps someone had broken in, but no one answered. The house was empty. Trembling, I opened the door, finding nothing. Just the dim hallway, the shadows stretching like dark fingers across the floor. After that night, I started noticing more unsettling things. Mirrors would fog up even when the house was cold, and sometimes words would appear written in the condensation. The first one was just a single word: leave. I thought it must be a prank, though I lived alone. I wiped it away, attributing it to a draft or some trick of light. But then the messages became more specific. You are not safe. She watches. I tried to research the house's history, digging through old newspapers and public records. What I found was disturbing. The house had belonged to a woman named Evelyn Harrow, who had died under mysterious circumstances in the 1930s. Neighbors reported hearing her scream the night she died, and some claimed she had been seen wandering the halls afterward. Several subsequent tenants had moved out abruptly, often citing fear or feeling watched. The next night, I had trouble sleeping. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft humming, low and mournful, coming from the kitchen. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The humming grew louder, more distinct, a woman's voice carrying a melody I didn't recognize but felt unnervingly familiar, almost mournful, almost pleading. I got up, flashlight in hand, and followed the sound. The kitchen was empty. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound except the old refrigerator humming. Yet, when I turned on the light, the humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. I backed away, feeling the air grow colder, my breath visible despite the heating being on. Then I saw her, a figure in the corner of the kitchen, translucent, wearing an old-fashioned dress, her hair hanging in tangled waves around her face. She was staring at me, unblinking, her eyes hollow. I froze, unable to move, and then she whispered, "Help me." I stumbled backward, heart pounding, and ran to my bedroom, locking the door. I spent the rest of the night huddled under the covers, shaking. The next morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, I told myself it was a dream, a hallucination born of stress and exhaustion. But I knew, deep down, it hadn't been. Over the next few weeks, the manifestations intensified. Objects moved on their own, often small things at first. A book on the floor that I had left on a shelf, kitchen utensils rearranged, my bed covers pulled back as if someone had been lying there. The cold spots grew more frequent, accompanied by the faint scent of lilacs, Evelyn Harrow's favorite flower according to the old letters I had found in the attic. Sometimes I would hear whispers in the night, too quiet to make out words, but unmistakably there. One night, it escalated into something I could no longer ignore. I was sitting in the living room, reading, when I felt a weight on my shoulder. I turned slowly, and there she was again, Evelyn, more solid than before, her face contorted in anguish. She reached out to me, mouth opening in a silent scream. I fell backward, heart hammering, and she vanished as suddenly as she appeared. Terrified, I decided I had to leave. I packed a bag, intending to spend a night with a friend to escape the relentless presence. That night, as I drove away, I felt a sense of relief, thinking I had left the house behind. But then, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the window, watching me go, her expression sorrowful yet accusing. The following days were sleepless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. She appeared in mirrors, in shadows, at the edge of my vision. I could feel her presence constantly, like a weight pressing down, reminding me I hadn't truly escaped. I called a local historian, someone who had studied the town's history, hoping for answers. He listened carefully as I recounted everything. When I finished, he said, "You're experiencing what the town calls the Harrow effect. Evelyn Harrow's spirit never rested. She's been trapped in that house, reliving her last night over and over. Some say she latches on to anyone who enters, trying to tell her story, seeking help, though no one can ever truly help her." I didn't know what to do. Staying in the house was impossible, but leaving her behind didn't feel right either. I consulted a spiritual medium, an older woman named Lillian, who agreed to visit. She arrived at dusk, carrying candles, incense, and a sense of calm that I had not felt in weeks. Lillian moved through the house slowly, murmuring prayers and softly calling Evelyn's name. The air grew heavy, colder, as if the house itself was resisting. Then in the parlor she paused, eyes widening. "She's here," she said. "More than I expected. She's angry, but trapped. She doesn't understand she's dead. She's reliving it." Lillian instructed me to speak to Evelyn, to try to reassure her. I felt ridiculous at first, speaking aloud to an invisible presence, but I said, trembling, "Evelyn, I know you're here. I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe. It's okay to rest." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. The lights flickered, and I saw her, standing at the foot of the stairs, expression softening, tears glinting in her eyes. She nodded once, as if acknowledging me, and slowly faded from view. The house grew quiet after that. The cold spots, the whispers, the shadows, they all diminished over the following nights. I still felt a residual unease, a faint sense that she lingered somewhere, but it was no longer oppressive. I stayed in the house, learning to coexist with its history, respecting the presence that had once haunted me so relentlessly. Years later, I still live there. I've told a few close friends the story, though many dismiss it as stress-induced hallucinations or overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I know the way the air felt, heavy and cold, the way her eyes met mine, pleading for help she could never quite receive. On quiet nights, I sometimes hear a faint humming, almost like a lullaby drifting down the hallway. I never approach it anymore. I simply listen, and I remember the sleepless nights when the past was not dead, when a ghostly presence made an ordinary house a place of terror and sorrow. The house stands still, and I remain within it, always aware that some stories never end. Evelyn's story, her grief and anguish, is embedded in the walls. Sometimes I sense her watching from the corners of my vision, silent but ever present. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howls through the trees and the moon casts shadows across the floor, I remember that feeling of being truly, completely alone, yet never truly alone, haunted by the echo of a life that ended long ago, leaving behind a restless soul who could not move on. Story the end. It was the kind of night where the wind seemed to carry whispers and the clouds moved across the moon like they were chasing shadows. I had just moved into a small, weathered house on the outskirts of a quiet town in Pennsylvania, the kind of town where everyone knew each other and rumors traveled faster than the mail. The house itself had been empty for over a year, sitting at the end of a long, winding road surrounded by dense woods. I'd gotten it for a bargain, and being fresh out of college with a fledgling career in writing, I couldn't resist the solitude it promised. The first few days were quiet, almost painfully so. I unpacked boxes, set up my laptop, and tried to make the place feel like home. At night, though, the house seemed to breathe differently. Creaks in the floorboards weren't unusual, but sometimes I could swear I heard soft footsteps in the hallway when I was alone. The kind of steps that didn't match the rhythm of someone moving normally, like someone testing the floor as they went. I tried to tell myself it was the house settling, or maybe just my imagination. It started on a Tuesday. I was up late working on a short story about a recluse who discovers an old diary in an abandoned house. Around 2 a.m., I heard a knock on the front door. Sharp, deliberate, 3 times in quick succession. My first thought was that it was some drunk kid from town, or maybe a neighbor who had taken a wrong turn. I peeked through the peephole. Nothing. No shadows, no movement, just the faint outline of the overgrown garden beyond the porch light. I shook my head and went back to my laptop, dismissing it as the wind. But the knocking didn't stop entirely. It came intermittently throughout the night. Always 3 quick raps, then silence. By the end of the week, the sensation of being watched was almost unbearable. I would catch glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows that vanished when I turned to look. Doors I was certain I had locked were sometimes found slightly ajar. The first real incident happened one night around midnight. I was in the kitchen making a cup of tea when I felt an icy draft brush past me. The window above the sink was closed, the curtains untouched. I froze, staring at the darkness of the living room. Then I saw it, a figure, standing at the far end of the hall. It wasn't fully visible, just a vague silhouette, like someone wrapped in shadow. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart was hammering, and I told myself it had to be exhaustion, stress, anything but what my mind was screaming. Sleep became impossible. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the trees sounded like someone moving through the house. I started recording the nights on my phone, hoping to catch something rational, something explainable. One night around 3 a.m., my phone picked up a voice. Not a whisper, not a groan, but a clear, deliberate phrase. Get out. It was faint, almost drowned by the hum of the refrigerator, but it was there. My blood ran cold. I replayed the clip over and over, hoping my mind was playing tricks, but there it was, undeniable. I called the previous owner the next day, a woman in her 60s named Marjorie, sweet in a quiet, reserved way. She chuckled when I asked if anything strange had ever happened in the house. Strange? She said. Oh, honey, I never stayed the night after the second winter. The house, it's old. It remembers things. I pressed her for details, and she finally admitted something that sent a chill down my spine. There was a girl, back in the early 50s, I think, lived here with her parents. She didn't make it to 16. Some accident, they said, or maybe she just disappeared. No one really knew. But folks around here, they say her spirit never left. That night, I dreamt of her. At first, it seemed like a normal dream. I was wandering the woods behind the house, mist curling around the trees, when I saw her. She was standing by a tree, looking directly at me, pale and fragile, her eyes large and dark. I tried to approach, but my feet wouldn't move. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then the scene shifted. I was back in the house, in the hallway, and she was there too, staring at me from the top of the stairs. I woke up drenched in sweat, my phone beside me, still recording the eerie creaks of the old house. I started researching local archives. The town library had old newspapers dating back decades, and eventually I found her. Lillian Carmichael, born in 1937, disappeared in 1953. Her parents reported her missing after a weekend at a friend's house, but the police never found her. Neighbors remembered her as a shy, quiet girl, often wandering the woods near her home. Some claimed she would talk to invisible friends, laugh for no reason, cry for no reason. The last article mentioned a search party, a frantic effort that turned up nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished into the mist. After learning her story, the activity in the house intensified. Footsteps in the hallway became more frequent, knocks at the door no longer random, but in discernible patterns. I started to hear murmuring, soft but insistent, like a voice just behind the walls. One night, while lying in bed, I saw her again, standing at the foot of the bed. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. My body was frozen, panic clawing at my chest. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. When I dared to open them again, she was gone. I tried everything. Salt lines, sage, even burning incense. Nothing worked. The presence was patient, persistent, growing stronger in intensity as the nights went on. I took to carrying a small flashlight to bed, leaving it on, hoping the light would protect me. That didn't help either. One night, the flashlight went out on its own, the beam extinguished as if smothered. I could feel her presence close, and then the whispers came again, this time unmistakable. Leave now. The breaking point came one Thursday. I had been up all night, trying to write, but the interruptions had left me exhausted. Around 2:30 a.m., the room felt impossibly cold. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight, and I could hear her whispering from the hall near the front door. I grabbed my coat and keys, intending to leave when I saw it. A small handprint, pressed into the frost on the window by the door. I had the sudden, horrifying realization that I wasn't just being watched. I was being contained, observed, almost toyed with. I ran. I drove into town, the headlights cutting through the fog, heart hammering. I didn't stop until I reached a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. I told the waitress what had happened, expecting her to dismiss me as a hysterical young man, but she nodded solemnly. You saw her too, she said quietly. She explained that at every few years, someone would move into the house and report the same things. We all know about Lillian, she said. Poor girl, she doesn't let go. The next morning, I went back thinking maybe I could rationalize things with daylight. But the house was quiet, eerily so, as if nothing had happened. No handprints, no cold drafts, no whispers. I started doubting myself, thinking maybe I had imagined it all. Then, while unpacking a box in the living room, I found a small notebook. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn. Inside were pages of tiny, careful handwriting. At first, I thought it might belong to the previous owner, but the entries were dated decades before she had sold the house. The name at the top of the first page, Lillian Carmichael. Her writing was fragmented, filled with fear and longing. She wrote about loneliness, of being watched by someone she couldn't see. She wrote about voices at night, telling her secrets she didn't want to hear. One page made my stomach turn. It was a list of names, including mine, written as if she knew I would be here. From that day on, my nights were filled with her presence, growing more insistent. The shadows followed me, the whispers never ceased, and the knocks at the door became pounding raps. I tried to ignore her, to reason with her, even to talk to her, but nothing worked. Sometimes I would find objects moved, not just around the house, but in impossible places, like my laptop on the kitchen counter when I had left it on my bed. The locals stopped asking me if I was okay. They would nod knowingly when I drove past, murmuring about Lillian's house and the way the air seemed to thicken around it at night. One elderly man told me, "She doesn't hurt people. She just watches and waits. If you stay too long, she won't let you leave." Sleep became a memory. I would sit in the corner of my bedroom, eyes wide, listening to the subtle shifting of the floorboards, the creaking that came in time with my heartbeat, the whispers brushing against the walls. Sometimes I would see her out of the corner of my eye, the pale girl standing silently by the door or at the foot of the stairs, always watching, always waiting. One night, desperate, I decided to confront her. I spoke her name aloud, asking why she lingered, why she haunted the house so fiercely. The house responded in silence at first. Then the temperature dropped until my breath came in visible puffs. A single sentence echoed in the darkness, low, distant, but clear. Because no one listens. I tried listening after that, leaving small notes in the house, talking to her as I moved from room to room. Sometimes she responded with noises, knocks, or subtle movements, as if acknowledging me, yet always keeping her distance. Months passed, and I realized the only way to survive the nights was to coexist, to give her attention without fear. The house became a delicate balance of acknowledgement and retreat. I never fully understood Lillian, but over time I grew accustomed to the rhythm of her presence. The knocks, the whispers, the fleeting shadows, they became a nightly companion rather than a tormentor. Still, sleep was rare, and the nights stretched endlessly. The townsfolk sometimes whispered that newcomers never stayed more than a year, but I had chosen to endure, to observe, to survive within the haunted walls. Even now, years later, I sit in the dim glow of my desk lamp, the wind carrying distant whispers through the cracks of the old windows. Every so often, I catch a shadow moving just beyond my vision, or hear a soft, deliberate knock at the door. And I remember the first night I felt her presence, the night I realized some ghosts don't leave, no matter how hard you wish them to. And though I've adapted, I know one truth. Some spirits are patient, and Lillian has all the time in the world. Story the end. It was around 3 a.m. when I realized I hadn't slept a wink. The storm outside had been raging for hours, pounding the roof of my small apartment with relentless rain, and the wind rattled the windows so violently that it sounded like someone or something was trying to break in. I had moved into this place just a few weeks prior in a quiet neighborhood of upstate New York. It was an old building, probably dating back to the early 1900s, with creaking floors and narrow hallways. But the rent was cheap, and I thought it was charming. Until that night, I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm, trying to convince myself that my inability to sleep was just nerves from working late and the stress of moving. But there was something else in the air that night, something I couldn't name. At first, it was subtle. The faint smell of something musty, like wet earth and old paper, would drift from the hallway into my room. Then came the sounds. Not the wind or the storm, but soft, almost inaudible whispers that seemed to come from the corner of the room. I sat up, straining my ears. "Hello?" I called softly, thinking it might be a neighbor, though the walls were thick and I never heard anyone else in the building at this hour. Nothing. The whispering stopped as soon as I spoke. I tried to shrug it off and lie back down, but sleep was impossible. My mind wouldn't stop racing. Every creak of the floorboards sounded exaggerated, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing just outside my bedroom door. I convinced myself it was paranoia. Old buildings make noises, I told myself. That's all. Then I heard it again. This time, unmistakably. The whisper came closer, clearer, almost directly behind me. A cold draft brushed the back of my neck. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly. And then I heard the words, "You shouldn't be here." They were soft, but they carried a weight, a presence. I froze, my entire body shaking. I couldn't see anything in the darkness of my room, only the faint outlines of furniture in the dim light of the storm outside. I whispered back, "Who's there?" But no answer came, only silence, thick and oppressive. I told myself to get up, to turn on the lights, but I couldn't. It was as if some invisible force was holding me in place, and then I felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, brush against my shoulder. Not a soft touch, but a deliberate, pressing touch, like someone was testing the boundaries of my panic. I bolted upright in bed, my entire body drenched in sweat. The room was empty. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of my bed, fully clothed, staring at the doorway, listening. And I heard more. Faint footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment, the soft dragging of what sounded like chains, the whispering. Always whispering, just beyond comprehension. Morning came slowly. I was exhausted, bleary-eyed, but I had to leave for work. I told myself it was a bad dream, an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion and the storm. But when I opened the door to leave, I saw the marks on the floor, scuffs that hadn't been there before, like someone had been pacing in my apartment. And the air smelled damp and musty, stronger than I remembered. I spent the next few days on edge. Every time I walked into my apartment, I felt it. The weight of being watched, a presence lurking just out of sight. At first, I tried ignoring it. I told myself that maybe it was a rodent or the building settling. But the disturbances became harder to explain. Objects moved from where I left them. A chair would be facing the wrong direction, my keys would vanish and reappear in strange places, and sometimes I'd hear the whispers again, almost conversational, like someone was speaking to a friend just beyond my vision. One night, unable to bear it anymore, I decided to record the sounds. I left my phone on a table and set it to record, then went to bed. The storm was raging again, and I stayed awake, listening. Around 2 a.m., the familiar whispering returned, soft and hesitant. "Why did you come here?" it asked. My blood ran cold. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to be asleep, hoping it would go away. The whispering stopped, replaced by a faint shuffling, like footsteps moving toward my bedroom. In the morning, I played the recording. My hands shook as I listened. At first, there was only the sound of rain and the occasional creak. Then, faintly, a voice emerged, an old, dry voice, whispering in fragmented phrases. "Leave. Leave now. You don't belong. I see you, always watching." The more I listened, the more I realized the whispers weren't random. They were directed at me. At that moment, I knew this wasn't just stress or imagination. Something was in my apartment, and it had been here long before I arrived. I began researching the building's history. According to old newspaper archives, the previous tenant had disappeared nearly a decade ago. The landlord's vague explanation was that they had moved suddenly, but neighbors whispered about strange occurrences. Doors slamming by themselves, lights flickering, whispers at night. Some claimed they saw a figure pacing the hallways, never entering or leaving, just existing. One night, determined to confront whatever this was, I stayed awake again. The storm had subsided, leaving an eerie, cold silence. Around midnight, the whispers returned, closer than ever. I stood in the middle of the living room, glaring into the shadows. "I'm not leaving," I said aloud, voice trembling. "You can't scare me away." For a moment there was silence. Then a shadow shifted in the corner of my vision. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. My chest tightened, and I felt a presence move behind me, circling, observing. And then I heard it, directly in my ear, though no one was there. "You can't stay. Not for long. It's mine." The words were venomous, possessive. I bolted to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of water, and tried to calm myself. But it was too late. I felt the room shift, the air growing heavy, thick, almost tangible, pressing against me. The whispers multiplied, a chorus of fragmented voices, angry and pleading at the same time. I decided to leave that night. I packed my essentials, called a friend, and drove out of the neighborhood. As I left, I glanced back at the building. From my rearview mirror, I swear I saw a figure standing in my apartment window watching me leave, impossibly still. I didn't return for weeks. But curiosity, or maybe obsession, drew me back one evening. I wanted to understand what I had experienced. The building was quiet, the hallways dark and empty. But when I entered my apartment, the temperature dropped instantly. The air smelled musty, like wet earth, stronger than ever. And then I saw it. My furniture shifted, but not randomly. Every piece had been arranged in a deliberate pattern, as if marking a path or a boundary. I followed the pattern to the corner of my living room. That's when I saw it. A faint outline, like almost translucent, of a man. His face was hollowed, eyes dark and empty, yet fixed directly on me. I froze. He raised a hand slowly, pointing toward the hallway. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. He whispered, barely audible, "You feel it too, the pull, the sleeplessness. It's mine to keep." I staggered backward, heart hammering. The outline dissipated, leaving the corner dark and cold. I didn't stay another second. I left, this time for good, and found a small apartment in a new town. But sleep didn't come easy. Weeks later, I realized the whispers hadn't left me. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, when the wind pressed against my new windows, I would hear them. Soft, insistent, a voice I recognized immediately. "I see you, always, never alone." I moved again, thinking maybe distance would help, but it never did. No matter where I went, the whispers followed, always at the edge of perception, always at night, always when I tried to sleep. Years have passed since that first stormy night, but the memory is fresh every time darkness falls. I still live in the United States, in a modest apartment, surrounded by neighbors, surrounded by light, but sleep never comes easy. Sometimes I lie awake for hours, listening, hoping it's just the wind, but deep down, I know better. Something followed me from that old apartment building, something that doesn't sleep, something that watches, something that whispers. And sometimes, just when I think I'm safe, I hear it. A soft, deliberate whisper in the corner of the room, a cold brush against my neck, the unmistakable feeling of being observed. And I know then that the sleepless nights are not mine alone. They belong to something else. Something American, something ancient, something that knows my name and watches when I'm most vulnerable. Even now, I write this in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, because I know that if I close my eyes for too long, it might be closer than I realize, and I've accepted it. I always will. The presence has made my nights its own. My dreams are invaded, my reality is shadowed, and no matter where I go, it waits, quietly, patient, whispering, "You can't escape. You never were alone." I have learned not to fight it, not to question it. I simply endure. The storm that first night was nothing compared to the storm that follows me everywhere now. And when the rain hits the windows, when the wind rattles the doors, I know it is only announcing itself, reminding me of what is always there, just out of sight in the silence of the night. I have never slept well since, and I never will. Story the end. It started on an unusually cold October night in a small town in northern Pennsylvania. I had recently moved into an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, a place I thought would be perfect for me. Quiet streets, lots of trees, and an air of history that made it feel lived in, but not crowded. The house was 3 stories, with creaky wooden floors, a narrow spiral staircase, and windows that rattled in even the faintest wind. The previous owners had left it largely untouched for years, and while it was charming, there was an undeniable musty smell that clung to the air, a mix of old wood, dampness, and something I couldn't quite identify. The first few nights were uneventful, though I felt an odd weight pressing down on me in the evenings. It was subtle at first, an uneasiness I couldn't shake, a feeling of being watched that I attributed to nerves. I had a long day at work and often stayed up late, unpacking boxes or organizing the house, but around midnight, when the world outside was silent, I would sometimes hear something I couldn't explain. The faint sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I remember the first night it scared me. I was sitting on the edge of my bed reading a book when I heard it. Slow, measured footsteps, pacing in the hallway. My apartment had been empty since I moved in, so I knew no one else was there. I froze, listening. The steps stopped, then a whisper, barely audible, brushed against my ear. "Why are you here?" I dropped the book and turned on every light I could find. Nothing. No one. The hallway was empty, silent, but the air felt heavier than before. I tried to convince myself it was imagination. Old houses make noises, I told myself, but the unease stayed. I slept little that night, the creaking floorboards and the occasional whisper keeping me on edge. Over the next few days, the phenomena increased. Objects in my house would shift overnight, seemingly moved by an invisible hand. Chairs would face the wrong direction, kitchen utensils would appear in odd places, and on more than one occasion, I would wake up to find doors I was sure I had locked left slightly ajar. Each night, the whispers became clearer, forming fragmented sentences. They never spoke directly to me, but I could feel them trying. The words were sometimes pleading, sometimes accusatory, but always intentional. One night, I decided to confront whatever was in the house. I stayed awake, pacing the living room with a flashlight in hand. Around 2 a.m., I heard the familiar sound of footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. I climbed the spiral staircase, heart pounding, calling out, "Who's there?" Silence. Then a shadow flickered across the landing at the top of the stairs. It was brief, a wisp of darkness moving against the dim light from the street outside, but it was unmistakable. I followed it to the master bedroom, the largest room in the house, and froze. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. Not fully formed, more like a dark outline, but humanoid. Its face was obscured, but I felt its gaze piercing through me. The temperature dropped, and my breath formed clouds in the cold air. The whispers returned, louder now, circling me, almost conversational. "You shouldn't have come. This is mine. Leave." I bolted down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until I reached my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, shivering, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. When I finally returned, hours later, the house was quiet, but the air still smelled musty, with a hint of something metallic, like old blood. The next day, I tried to research the history of the house. I learned that it had been built in 1892, and over the decades, it had changed hands numerous times. The most disturbing story was about a family who had lived there in the 1930s. According to local records, the youngest child, a boy named Henry, had died under mysterious circumstances in the house. The parents moved away soon after, and the house remained largely abandoned until I bought it. Locals whispered that Henry's spirit never left, that he lingered, confused and angry, waiting for someone to notice him. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, listening. The air grew thick and heavy, and I felt the presence again, closer than ever. The whispers were clear, almost intelligible. "Why won't you leave? You don't belong here. I see you." In the following weeks, the occurrences escalated. I would wake up in the middle of the night to see shadows moving across the walls, always at the edge of my vision. Doors slammed shut on their own. Windows rattled violently, even when there was no wind, and the whispers became almost constant. I began recording audio at night, hoping to capture something that I could explain rationally. The recordings were disturbing. Among the normal sounds of an old house, the groans of settling wood, the creak of floorboards were whispers, often overlapping, sometimes a single voice, sometimes several. The phrases were short, broken, but filled with intent. "You see me, always. Leave now." I reached out to a paranormal investigator, someone recommended by a friend. He came to the house and set up cameras and recording equipment. For a few nights, nothing happened, or so it seemed. Then, late one night, he called me in a panic. The monitors had caught movement. Shadowy figures crossing rooms, objects levitating slightly, and a faint shape that resembled a small boy standing at the top of the stairs, staring directly into the camera. The investigator admitted that he had never encountered anything quite like this in his career. I realized I was dealing with something that was intelligent, aware, and territorial. The presence wasn't malevolent in a violent way, but it was possessive. It wanted the house, it wanted the attention, and it was not pleased with my presence. I tried everything: salt lines, religious symbols, even having a medium come to perform a cleansing ritual. The medium said the spirit was old, rooted, confused, and resentful. She warned that forceful removal could provoke anger. The best I could do was coexist, though she doubted that would be easy. One night in late November, after weeks of nearly sleepless nights, the presence grew more aggressive. I woke to find my bedroom door slowly opening on its own. The room was colder than ever, and I saw the outline of the figure standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and accusatory. My body refused to move, my mind frozen in terror. After what felt like hours, the figure dissipated, leaving the room dark and suffocating. I didn't sleep again that night. I began documenting everything meticulously: the times, the sounds, the appearances, the interactions. I wanted to understand, to see a pattern, and slowly a pattern emerged. The activity was most intense around the anniversary of Henry's death, late October. It seemed to escalate in stages, growing from whispers to tangible presences, culminating in direct manifestations. I realized I was experiencing a ritual of sorts, unknowingly timed to this cycle. By January, I had adjusted my life around the disturbances. I no longer attempted normal sleep. Instead, I spent the nights awake, observing, documenting, and recording. I would sit in the living room, lights dimmed, waiting for the presence to appear. And it always did, sometimes immediately, sometimes hours later. I learned its habits, the subtle signs of its approach. A sudden drop in temperature, the faint smell of damp earth, the whispering at the threshold of comprehension. One particularly long night, I had an encounter that I will never forget. It was close to midnight, the house silent but for the faint hum of the heater. I was sitting in the living room, audio recorder in hand, when I heard the distinct sound of a child's laughter, soft but clear. It echoed through the halls, bouncing off walls, coming closer. I followed it cautiously, up the spiral staircase to the master bedroom. The door was closed, though I had left it open. I opened it slowly, and there he was, a small boy, pale and translucent, standing in the center of the room. His eyes were dark, hollow, but fixed on me. He raised a hand slowly, pointing to the corner of the room, where an old wooden chest sat. I approached cautiously. The chest was locked, but as I neared, the lock clicked open on its own. Inside, I found a few old toys, dusty and faded, and a small leather-bound diary. I picked it up and opened it. The pages were brittle, filled with a child's handwriting, detailing mundane daily life, but ending abruptly with a line that chilled me. "They are coming. I am afraid. I cannot leave." The figure watched me silently. I spoke softly. "Henry, I'm not going to hurt you." The boy's outline shimmered, then faded, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence. For the first time in weeks, the house felt empty, though not safe. I realized the presence wasn't entirely malevolent. It was lonely, trapped, and resentful, bound to the house by circumstances that I would never fully understand. Over the next several months, the activity decreased slightly. The whispering continued. The occasional shadow moved at the edge of my vision, but the full manifestations became less frequent. I learned to live with it, though sleep remained impossible. I had resigned myself to perpetual vigilance, understanding that I shared my life with a spirit that would not leave. Even now, years later, I can feel its presence in moments of quiet. A cold draft, a whispered word, a fleeting shadow. Sleep never comes easily. I have moved to another house since then, seeking peace, but I have learned that once you encounter something like this, it never truly leaves. It follows you, lurking in the corners of memory, in the darkness of night, in the quiet moments when your guard is down. The sleepless nights have become a part of me. I live with the knowledge that somewhere, in the shadows of forgotten houses, in the creaking of old floors, in the soft whispering that brushes against your consciousness, there are presences like the one I encountered. And I know now, beyond doubt, that they watch, they wait, and they remember. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, the nights remain haunted. I have learned to accept the whispers, to live in the weight of their attention, because fighting them only intensifies their presence. The house on the outskirts of Pennsylvania still stands, and I am certain that the boy, Henry, waits for the next inhabitant, continuing his quiet vigil, longing for acknowledgement, bound to his home by a force I cannot explain, nor would I dare to. And so on nights like tonight, when the wind rattles my new windows, when the shadows stretch longer than they should, I feel him again. The whispers brush my ear, soft and insistent, reminding me that sleep is a luxury I will never have, that some presences are eternal, and that the weight of the night belongs not to me, but to them. I have lived in America my whole life, yet nothing I have experienced compares to that sleepless, ghostly night. I have never truly felt alone, not since, and I doubt I ever will. Story the end. I had always thought of myself as someone grounded in logic and reason, someone who explained away creaks in the floorboards as the natural settling of an old house, shadows in the corner as tricks of dim lighting and cold drafts as the inevitable flaws of old insulation. But everything I thought I understood about the world was tested one sleepless night, a night that still lingers in my bones when I lie awake in the dark. It started in the winter of 2014 when I rented a modest two-story home in western Pennsylvania. I had taken a new job at a nearby manufacturing plant and needed something cheap and relatively close to work. The house I found had been standing for more than a century, tucked at the end of a road with only one neighboring house a good 100 yards away. It was white with peeling paint, green shutters, and a front porch that sagged ever so slightly. It looked worn but harmless, the kind of place where you'd expect to see kids playing in the yard and an old dog lazing in the sun. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I was working long shifts and coming home exhausted, barely noticing much beyond the basics. But little by little, details about the house began to make themselves known. I would hear faint tapping in the walls at night, which I assumed was either mice or the pipes. Doors seemed to drift open on their own, though I blamed uneven floors and old hinges. And then there was the cold. Even with the furnace running, certain rooms never seemed to warm up, especially the upstairs bedroom that I had chosen as my own. I remember lying under layers of blankets, watching my breath puff faintly in the air, even though the thermostat claimed the house was at 70 degrees. I told myself it was quirks of an old house. Everyone said these places had personality. But then came the first night that unsettled me enough to lose sleep. I woke around 2:45 a.m. to the sound of footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate, like boots pressing down on old wood. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I shot out of bed, heart pounding, and grabbed the aluminum baseball bat I kept by the dresser. I stood frozen, listening as the steps reached the top landing just outside my bedroom door. I stared at the crack at the bottom of the door, waiting for a shadow to break the strip of faint light from the hall. But nothing moved. When I swung the door open, the hallway was empty. I walked the whole house, checking closets and even the crawl space, but found nothing. Every door was locked from the inside, every window shut tight. I told myself it had to be the house settling, but I knew what footsteps sounded like, and these hadn't been the random pops and creaks of wood. These had been deliberate, paced, almost measured. Over the next few weeks, the footsteps returned sporadically, always around the same time, between 2 and 3 in the morning. Sometimes they stopped at the top of the stairs, sometimes they moved past my bedroom toward the guest room down the hall. Once, they came right up to my door and stopped. I lay there holding my breath, waiting for a knock that never came. Sleep became difficult. I started dreading the nights, staying up late with the TV on, just to distract myself. But no matter how long I tried to avoid it, exhaustion always pulled me into sleep, and I'd wake again to the sound of someone pacing my house. I stopped mentioning it to coworkers after one of them joked that I should call the Ghostbusters. They laughed, but it wasn't funny to me. One particularly bad night in early March, I woke not to footsteps, but to the sensation of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. The mattress dipped, pressing down near my legs. My heart went into my throat, and for a second, I convinced myself I must still be dreaming. But the weight stayed, solid and real. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt from the room, but my body betrayed me, frozen stiff. Slowly the pressure lifted, and I heard the faint sound of fabric brushing the floor, like someone rising to their feet. The air turned icy cold, so cold that the hair on my arms stood straight up. I finally managed to snap on the lamp, but of course, the room was empty. That was the first time I considered leaving the house. But finances kept me there. Rent was dirt cheap, and I had nowhere else to go. So I told myself I'd stick it out, maybe get used to it, but I never did. One weekend in April, my younger sister came to visit. I didn't tell her much about what had been happening. I didn't want to scare her off. But she noticed the atmosphere immediately. She said the house felt heavy, like walking into a room where someone had just been fighting. That night, she slept in the guest room at the end of the hall. Around 3 in the morning, she burst into my room, pale and shaking. She swore she had woken up to see a man standing in the corner of the room. She described him as tall, wearing some kind of dark coat, but his face was obscured, like shadow covered it entirely. He hadn't moved, just stood there watching until she screamed. By the time she flicked on the lamp, he was gone. I didn't doubt her. Everything she described lined up with the feelings I'd had, the sense of someone pacing at night, the weight on the bed. But now there was a shape, a figure to put to the sounds. She left the next morning and refused to stay over again. After that, the activity seemed to escalate. Doors slammed in the middle of the night. My TV would turn on by itself, the static so loud it rattled me awake. I began hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, especially when I stood at the top of the stairs. It always sounded like someone speaking just out of earshot, but when I strained to catch words, the sound would fade. The worst came one night in late May. I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. And when I finally drifted off, I had a dream, or what I thought was a dream at first. In it, I was lying in my own bed, staring at the ceiling. A cold hand pressed against my throat, pinning me down. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My vision blurred, and I could hear a voice whispering rapidly in my ear, words I couldn't understand. When I snapped awake, I was gasping, clutching my throat. The skin was ice cold to the touch, and in the mirror the next morning, I found faint red marks across my neck, like the impression of fingers. That was when I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was in that house with me. Something I couldn't see fully, but could feel, hear, and sometimes even touch. I started researching the history of the place. At the county library, I dug through old records and newspaper archives. What I found chilled me. The house had belonged to the McAllister family in the early 1900s. The father, a coal miner, had died in an accident, and a few years later, one of the sons, a man named Thomas, had been found dead in the house under mysterious circumstances. The article didn't specify much, only that he had been discovered at the bottom of the stairs, his neck broken, though no one could explain how he had fallen. Some locals speculated it hadn't been an accident. After reading that, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe it was Thomas who lingered there. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he wanted something. The nights grew harder. Sleep became nearly impossible. I would lie in bed, heart racing at every creak, every whisper. Sometimes I'd see movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping past the doorframe, a figure on the stairs when I turned off the lights. Once, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and swore there was another figure standing just behind me, tall and dark, gone when I spun around. By July, I was unraveling. My coworkers said I looked sick. I drank coffee constantly just to stay awake at work. At night, I kept every light on, but it didn't matter. The footsteps still came, heavier now, sometimes accompanied by the sound of something dragging along the floor. I kept the bat by my bed, though I knew it would do no good. One night, the sleeplessness hit its peak. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing in so thick it was suffocating. And then, without warning, every door in the house slammed shut at once. The sound thundered through the walls, shaking the floor beneath me. I bolted upright, adrenaline surging. My lamp flickered, then went out, leaving me in darkness. That was when I heard it. The same footsteps, slow and deliberate, but this time inside my bedroom. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the presence, cold and oppressive, standing at the foot of my bed. The mattress dipped again, and I swear I felt a hand brush against my ankle. That was the breaking point. I leapt from the bed, stumbled down the stairs in the dark, and fled the house barefoot into the night. I sat in my truck until dawn, staring at the upstairs window, half expecting to see someone watching me from behind the glass. I didn't go back inside until I had a friend with me the next day. We packed up what I could and I moved into a cheap apartment in town. I never stepped foot in that house again. Even now, years later, I still wake some nights around 3 a.m., my heart pounding, convinced I hear those same heavy footsteps in the hall. I try to tell myself it's just memory, the mind playing cruel tricks. But deep down, I know what I felt, what I heard, what I saw. Something was in that house, and it didn't want me there. I'll never forget that ghostly and sleepless night when it finally showed me just how real it was. And even though I've moved on, a part of me will never sleep peacefully again. Story the end. I moved into the house just before the first frost of winter, an old colonial on the outskirts of a small town in New Hampshire. The town itself was quiet, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other but kept to themselves, where the streets were lined with bare trees and the occasional flicker of a street lamp offered the only light in the long, dark nights. The house had been empty for years, the previous owner having left abruptly and leaving behind an air of mystery that intrigued me more than it worried me. The realtor had mentioned the creaky floors and the drafty windows as minor quirks, but I brushed it off. After all, I had grown up in older homes, and the charm outweighed the inconvenience. The first night was uneventful enough. I unpacked boxes, made a quick dinner, and tried to settle in. But as midnight approached, I began to feel a weight pressing down in the corners of the room, a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. I told myself it was just my imagination, nerves, the excitement of being in a new place. I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, the blankets pulled tight around me. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the old windows, and the house groaned as if settling itself. But somewhere beneath the ordinary sounds, there was something else, something softer, something deliberate, almost like a whisper. I froze. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks, but the sound had a cadence, a rhythm, almost as if words were being formed. "Why are you here?" it seemed to ask. My heart skipped, and I bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp on the bedside table. The light flickered on, and I scanned the room. Nothing. The shadows stretched long and distorted against the walls, but there was no one there. I tried to convince myself it was stress, exhaustion, the nerves of moving into a new place. But the whispering didn't stop. It returned intermittently through the night, soft and fragmented, never clear, never fully coherent, but always intentional, always directed. I couldn't ignore it, though I tried. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. Every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of wind through the eaves sounded amplified, purposeful, like footsteps pacing just beyond the edge of the light. The days that followed were unnerving. I would leave for work, come home, and find small disturbances in the house. Chairs slightly moved, objects out of place, doors I was certain I had locked left ajar. Each night, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent. Sometimes they were pleading, sometimes accusatory, always deliberate. It became impossible to convince myself that it was my imagination. I began to feel that I was not alone. One night, unable to endure the fear of the unseen, I decided to stay awake, to confront whatever was there. I paced the living room with a flashlight in hand, my pulse quickening with every creak of the floorboards. Around 2 a.m, I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps above me, on the second floor. I called out, my voice shaking, "Who's there?" Silence. A shadow flickered at the top of the staircase, a movement just beyond the reach of the light. I followed it, heart hammering, into the master bedroom. There, in the corner of the room, stood a figure. It was dark, formless, yet unmistakably human-shaped. I froze. The temperature dropped sharply, and my breath came out in little clouds. The whispers returned, louder now, almost intelligible. "You don't belong here. Leave. You shouldn't have come." I bolted, fleeing down the stairs and out of the house, sitting in my car for what felt like hours. I could still feel the presence, heavy and oppressive, as if it were following me, judging me. Over the next weeks, the disturbances became routine. Objects moved, doors opened, shadows shifted, and the whispering persisted. I began documenting everything meticulously: times, sounds, appearances, the locations of disturbances. A pattern emerged. The activity was most intense at night, peaking near the anniversary of a historical event linked to the house, the death of a child who had lived there in the 1930s. According to town records, the boy, Henry, had died under mysterious circumstances, and locals whispered that his spirit lingered, restless, angry, and unable to leave the house. I decided to understand the spirit rather than flee. I researched the house's history, talked to neighbors, and read old newspaper articles. Each source reinforced the story. Henry had died tragically, alone, and the family had moved away abruptly. The house had remained empty for years, untouched, until I arrived. It seemed plausible that a child's spirit trapped in a traumatic place could linger, confused and resentful. As November approached, the disturbances escalated. I would wake at precisely 2:17 a.m., hearing the dragging of footsteps across the wooden floors, the soft whispers that always followed. Sometimes the whispers formed words, sometimes only fragments, but always demanding attention. I tried audio recording, hoping to capture evidence. On playback, the recordings were unsettling. Faint voices overlapping, repeating phrases like, "Leave, don't stay, I see you, always watching." It became clear that the spirit was aware of me, conscious of my presence, and increasingly frustrated with my intrusion. One night, around midnight, I awoke to find my bedroom door slowly opening on its own. The air was frigid, the kind that penetrates the bones. In the dim light, I saw a small, translucent figure standing at the foot of my bed. My body froze. It didn't move or speak, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and accusatory. Hours seemed to pass before the figure faded, leaving a stifling silence. I didn't sleep again that night. I reached out to a paranormal investigator, hoping for guidance. He spent several nights in the house, setting up cameras and recording devices. For a few nights, nothing happened, or so it seemed. Then one night, the monitors captured faint, humanoid shapes moving through the rooms, shadows that seemed to have intent, observing, waiting. The most unsettling capture was at the top of the stairs. A small boy, translucent, standing silently, staring down the staircase. The investigator admitted he had never seen anything like it in his career. The presence was intelligent, territorial, and persistent. I attempted traditional methods, salt lines, symbols. A medium performed a cleansing ritual. The medium explained the spirit was bound, confused, resentful, and that forceful removal could provoke anger. Coexistence was the only option, though uncomfortable. By January, I had adapted my life around the disturbances. Normal sleep was impossible. I spent nights awake, observing, recording, documenting. I learned the subtle signs of the spirit's approach, the drop in temperature, the musty smell of damp earth, the near whispering at the edge of hearing. The spirit demanded recognition and attention, and any attempt to ignore it intensified the activity. One particularly long night, I had a direct encounter. I heard the laughter of a child echoing softly through the halls. Following it cautiously, I climbed the spiral staircase to the master bedroom. In the center of the room stood a small boy, translucent, his eyes dark and hollow, fixed on me. He raised a hand slowly, pointing to the corner of the room where an old wooden chest sat. I approached cautiously, and the lock clicked open on its own, revealing dusty toys and a leather-bound diary. The boy's handwriting filled the pages, mundane at first, then abruptly ending with a chilling line. "They are coming. I am afraid. I cannot leave." The boy watched silently as I read. For the first time, I felt a connection. He was lonely, trapped, resentful, bound to the house by circumstances I could not change. The outline shimmered and faded, leaving a heavy silence. The activity decreased slightly after that, though the whispers persisted. Sleep remained impossible. I had learned to coexist with the presence, accept it as part of my nightly reality. Years later, I moved to a smaller apartment in another town, seeking peace, but the nights remained difficult. I occasionally feel the presence, subtle but unmistakable, a cold draft, a whispered word, a shadow at the edge of vision. Sleep never comes easily. Once you encounter such a presence, it never truly leaves. It follows you in memory, in quiet moments, in the corners of perception. I live with the knowledge that somewhere, in the shadows of old houses, spirits like Henry exist. They watch, they wait, and they remember. My nights are forever altered. I have learned to coexist with it, endure it, because fighting it only strengthens its hold. Even now, as I sit in my apartment, the wind rattles the windows and shadows stretch long across the walls. I feel him again, the subtle brush of cold air, the whisper at the edge of hearing, the undeniable weight of being watched. Sleep is a luxury I no longer possess. The nights belong not to me, but to the unseen who linger, patient and eternal. Once you glimpse the restless dead, the nights will never be yours again. The whispers, the shadows, the cold brush of presence, they become permanent companions. You carry them, and they carry you into sleepless nights, endlessly, relentlessly, until the end of your days. Story the end. The night I first understood that something unseen could move through a house as surely as a draft of cold air was one of those evenings that should have been unremarkable. I had worked a long day, gotten home late, and made myself a quick dinner. It was the kind of night where fatigue draped itself over you so thickly that you barely noticed anything outside the rhythm of your own body. Yet, by the time morning came, I hadn't slept at all. And in the years since, I still think of that night whenever the house settles oddly, or when silence becomes too thick to breathe through. I had been renting a small two-story house in upstate New York, not too far from Albany. It wasn't anything fancy, wooden floors that creaked no matter where you stepped, uneven heating that left the upstairs colder than the downstairs, and a faint smell of old wood that clung stubbornly no matter how much I aired the place out. The landlord had inherited it from his aunt and lived out of state, so I was left largely to myself. That independence appealed to me. At the time, I was in my late 20s, trying to save money, working long hours, and just grateful for a space that wasn't shared with roommates. I had lived there for about 6 months before the first really odd thing happened. That night had been one of those cool autumn evenings where the air outside carried the first sharp edge of winter. I had climbed into bed around midnight, shutting off the lamp and letting the quiet fill the room. The house had its own natural soundtrack: distant traffic, the occasional dog barking, the tick of the baseboard heater when it finally kicked on. I had grown used to those sounds. What I wasn't used to was the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps moving across the floor in the hallway outside my bedroom. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. My upstairs neighbors in the apartment I used to live in had trained me to filter out phantom noises in the night. But the thing was, I didn't have neighbors anymore. This was a house, and I was the only one living in it. I remember holding my breath, straining to listen. The sound was faint, but it carried the weight of movement. Not the random settling of wood, not the erratic scuttle of a mouse in the walls, but the steady pattern of someone walking slowly. It lasted only a few seconds, maybe long enough for 4 or 5 steps, and then it stopped right outside my bedroom door. I stared at the door, waiting for the knob to turn or for the sound to continue, but the silence that followed was worse than anything. I don't know how long I lay there, pulse thudding in my ears, before I finally worked up the nerve to whisper to myself that it had just been the house settling. My own voice sounded strange, too loud in the stillness. The next morning, I tried to push it out of my mind. Houses make noises, especially old ones, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how purposeful the steps had sounded. I told myself I had been too tired and that my brain had played a trick on me as I drifted towards sleep. That explanation held until a week later when I woke in the middle of the night and felt the air around me colder than it should have been. It wasn't just the drafty chill of an old house. It was sharp, cutting through the blankets, and worse, it felt localized, like it was centered at the foot of my bed. I opened my eyes to darkness, and for a moment I swore I could make out the faint outline of something standing there. Tall, indistinct, but present. My body locked, my breathing slowed to shallow gasps, and just like that, the air warmed again, the outline dissipated, and I was left alone. I didn't sleep again until the sun came up. That was when the sleepless nights began. At first, they were scattered, once every couple of weeks, then more frequently. I'd lie down exhausted, only to feel the air shift as though the house itself was waiting for me to close my eyes. Sometimes it was footsteps. Sometimes it was the sound of something brushing against the wall in the hallway. A few times I heard what I could only describe as a whisper, faint, so faint. I couldn't tell if it was in my ears or in my head. I stopped telling myself it was just the house after the night I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I always slept with it closed. The latch didn't hold well, but I would make sure it was shut. That night, I woke with the clear sound of the knob turning, the door opening slowly until a thin strip of light from the hall bled into the darkness. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might stop. I waited for someone to step in, but no one did. The door just stayed there, half open, while I stared at it until dawn lit the room. By then, I had stopped inviting friends over. I didn't want to explain the tension that hung over the house or the way I avoided the upstairs at night. A few times, I thought about calling my landlord and asking if anyone had died there. But I didn't. Something about saying it aloud, about acknowledging it, felt dangerous, like it would make whatever was happening more real. Sleep became scarce. Nights stretched long, each sound amplified until I felt raw from listening too closely. I'd sit up in bed, lights on, trying to read just to distract myself. But the longer I stayed in that house, the more it felt like I was being watched. Not from outside, but from within. One night in particular stands out, the one that finally broke whatever fragile denial I had been clinging to. It was around 2 a.m. I hadn't been able to sleep and had given up, sitting at my desk with my laptop, the soft glow of the screen the only light in the room. The rest of the house was dark and quiet. Too quiet. That was when I heard it, a dragging sound, faint but distinct, coming from downstairs. It was like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My stomach dropped. I froze, listening as it continued, slow and deliberate, stopping and starting as though someone was moving furniture inch by inch. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put. But fear mixes strangely with curiosity, and after several minutes I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling. I crept down the stairs, each step creaking far too loud in the stillness. When I reached the bottom, the living room looked untouched. The furniture was exactly where it should have been. I stood there heart-pounding, staring into the dim outlines of the room. And then, from the kitchen, came a whisper. Low, indistinct, but so close I felt the hairs on my arms rise. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakably human. I bolted. I didn't care what it was. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door into the freezing night air. I sat in my car with the engine running, headlights flooding the empty driveway, until the sky began to lighten. Only then did I force myself back inside. After that night, I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. Something was in that house with me. Something unseen but deliberate. Something that wanted to be known. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights. I started avoiding the bedroom, falling asleep on the couch instead. But the disturbances followed me there. Once, I woke to the sound of breathing behind me, so close it raised the fine hairs at the back of my neck. I turned, but the room was empty. Another time, I felt the cushions dip slightly, as if someone had sat down beside me. I never saw anything clearly, but the sense of presence became undeniable. It wasn't just random noise. It was focused, deliberate, as though whatever lingered there knew I was aware of it, and that awareness fed it somehow. By the time my lease was up, I was desperate to leave. I packed quickly, stuffing boxes without care, avoiding the upstairs at all costs. The last night I spent in that house, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat awake, lights blazing, waiting for dawn, and just before the first hint of morning broke, I heard the footsteps again, slow, steady, moving down the hallway upstairs. I knew then that I had never been alone in that house. Not once. Even now, years later, I sometimes find myself lying awake at night, listening too closely to the silence of my own home. It's never been as intense as it was in that house, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever I experienced wasn't bound to those walls, like it found me in that sleepless state and marked me somehow. Some nights, when exhaustion finally wins and I begin to drift, I swear I hear it again, the faintest whisper, the soft creak of a step on the floorboards. And when I open my eyes, the darkness feels heavier, as though something is standing just beyond sight, waiting. Story the end. The first time I ever experienced something I could not explain happened during the last year I spent in my college town in North Carolina. I had been renting an old house just off campus, a 2-story place that looked as though it hadn't had a proper renovation in decades. The floors creaked when you walked across them, the windows whistled in the wind, and the doors never seemed to shut properly. I rented it with 2 friends at first, but by the fall semester of my senior year, I was living there alone. My roommates had graduated early, and while I could have easily broken the lease and found somewhere else, I had grown attached to the place. It was cheap, close to classes, and I liked the solitude it offered me. At least I thought I liked the solitude. It started innocently. Small things that I brushed off. I'd leave my textbooks on the coffee table downstairs and find them on the kitchen counter the next morning. My shoes, which I always kicked off by the door, were sometimes sitting neatly at the bottom of the staircase. At first, I thought maybe I was moving things absent-mindedly. I was stressed, after all, juggling classes, a part-time job at the library, and the pressure of figuring out what to do after graduation. People get scatterbrained in those situations. But then the noises began. I would hear footsteps upstairs when I was sitting in the living room alone. Distinct, heavy steps, the kind that made the boards groan as if someone much larger than me was moving around. My immediate assumption was that maybe a raccoon or some other animal had gotten into the attic. But the problem with that theory was that the steps weren't random scurrying. They sounded like someone walking from one room to another, sometimes stopping and then starting again. A deliberate pattern, as though whoever or whatever was up there knew exactly where they were going. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself that old houses make noises, that wood expands and contracts, that my brain was exaggerating the normal sounds of an aging home. But one night in late October, I couldn't explain it away so easily. I was studying at the dining room table around midnight. The house was quiet except for the scratching of my pen against paper. Then I heard it, clear as day, the sound of a door slamming shut upstairs. I froze, every hair on my arm standing on end. I wasn't about to convince myself I imagined it because it was too loud, too sudden. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from under the sink and made my way up the creaky staircase. Every step I took, I expected someone to burst out from one of the rooms. But when I reached the top, every door stood wide open, just as I had left them. There was no one there. I checked the closets, the bathroom, even under the beds. Nothing. I told myself maybe the wind had slammed one of the doors, but the windows were all shut and the air was still. That night I barely slept. I lay in bed with the blanket pulled up to my chin, my ears straining for any sound. At some point I must have dozed off because I woke with a start around 3 a.m. My room was cold, colder than it had any right to be, since the heat was running. And then I heard it again. Footsteps, this time in the hallway, right outside my door. They walked slowly past my room, pausing just long enough that I swore whoever it was had stopped to listen. Then they continued down the hall and faded into silence. I couldn't move. I just lay there, stiff with fear, staring at my closed door. The next day, I brought it up to my friend Ashley, who worked with me at the library. She raised her eyebrows and asked if I was joking. When I told her I wasn't, she leaned closer and said, "That house has a reputation, you know." I asked her what she meant, and she explained that back in the 70s, a man had lived there who was rumored to be unstable. The story went that he died in the house. Some said suicide, others whispered something worse. But no one had wanted to live there afterward. Supposedly, it had sat empty for years until the college kids started renting it. She told me more than one group of students had reported strange things happening there. I wanted to dismiss it as campus folklore. Every college town has its ghost stories, and old houses are easy targets. But deep down, I knew something was happening in that house, and I wasn't imagining it. Things escalated in November. One morning I woke up to find every cabinet door in the kitchen wide open. I had gone to bed late, and I knew for a fact they had been shut when I turned off the light. It looked almost staged, every single door open to the maximum, like someone had wanted me to notice. Another time, I was brushing my teeth in the upstairs bathroom when the shower curtain suddenly jerked to one side as if someone had yanked it. My heart nearly stopped. There was no one behind it, of course. By this point, I was starting to lose sleep regularly. The footsteps, the slamming doors, the feeling that someone was always just out of sight, it wore me down. My friends noticed I looked pale and tired, and I stopped inviting people over because I didn't want to explain why they might hear strange noises in the night. The worst night came a week before Thanksgiving. I had stayed late at the library, not because I had work, but because I dreaded going home. When I finally did, it was around 11:30 p.m. The house was freezing again, even though I'd left the thermostat set to 70. I microwaved some leftovers and sat down in the living room to eat, the TV on low for background noise. That's when I heard it, the slow creak of someone coming down the stairs. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, staring at the darkened stairwell. The sound continued, one step at a time, deliberate and heavy. My stomach twisted in terror. I couldn't see anyone, but the footsteps were unmistakable. They reached the bottom step and stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Then the air grew icy, and I felt it. Someone standing just behind me, close enough that I should have been able to see them in my peripheral vision. I spun around, but the room was empty. That was the breaking point. The next morning, I went to the landlord and asked if I could break the lease early. He looked at me for a long moment, sighed, and said, "You're not the first one." That was all he said, but it was enough. I packed what I could fit into my car and crashed at Ashley's place until I found a new apartment. I didn't set foot in that house again, not even to grab the furniture I left behind. The landlord said he'd deal with it, and I was more than happy to let him. To this day, I don't know exactly what I experienced there. I've tried rationalizing it: stress, exhaustion, and overactive imagination. But the truth is, I can still hear those footsteps in my mind. They weren't in my head. They were real, and they belonged to something that didn't want me there. Years later, when I tell this story, people often ask if I regret leaving so quickly, if maybe I missed the chance to truly understand what was haunting that house. But I don't regret it at all. Some things aren't meant to be understood, and some presences are better left alone. I'll never forget that house or the way it made me feel, watched unwelcome, and never, ever alone. Story the end. The first time I stayed at my cousin's old farmhouse in upstate New York, I didn't expect to come away with something that would still keep me awake at night years later. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend retreat from the city, a way to unplug, breathe clean air, and help him patch up some parts of the house before the real cold set in. But I had no idea that house carried more than peeling wallpaper and drafty windows. It carried a weight, a presence, something that didn't belong among the living. The house sat about 20 minutes outside a small town, along a long stretch of country road that wound between endless fields and patches of dark woods. It had been in my cousin's wife's family for generations, built sometime in the late 1800s. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dropping low, throwing the house into shadow. It looked massive, though much of it hadn't been updated in decades. The shutters were chipped and crooked, and the wood siding had gone gray from time and weather. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and 2 rocking chairs sat there, unmoving. Though for a second as I pulled up, I could have sworn I saw one shift. Someone had just gotten out of it. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and something musty like old linens or damp earth. My cousin Mark gave me the quick tour. "You'll be in the guest room upstairs, second door on the left," he said, hoisting one of my bags. His wife, Angela, was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. She waved and gave me a tired smile. I remember thinking she looked pale, maybe thinner than the last time I'd seen her. Their daughter, Lily, was 5, a quiet little girl with dark eyes who clung to Angela's leg and watched me without saying much. After dinner, Mark and I sat on the porch drinking beer while Angela put Lily to bed. The woods at the back of the property were dark, the kind of black that seemed to swallow light. "House gives me the creeps sometimes," I admitted, trying to laugh it off. "Feels like it's holding secrets." Mark chuckled but didn't look amused. "Yeah, you're not the first to say that. Angie doesn't like to talk about it, but there's stuff, family stuff tied to this place." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. At the time, I thought he was just being dramatic. That night, lying in the guest room with its tall ceilings and faded wallpaper patterned with vines, I couldn't sleep. The house made noises, the kind of old house sounds you expect: wood settling, wind pressing against the eaves. But there was something sharper too. A distinct creak just outside my door, like the floorboards shifting under weight. I sat up in bed, listening hard. The hallway was empty when I cracked the door, with shadows stretching long under the dim yellow glow of a nightlight plugged into the far wall. The air felt cooler out there, heavy somehow. I told myself it was Mark checking on something, but when I listened again, the house was still. I must have drifted off eventually, but sometime after midnight I woke to a sound that turned my stomach cold. It was the distinct rhythm of someone breathing in the room. Not mine. Not shallow or distant, close, just to the side of the bed. My chest tightened as I held my breath, straining my ears. In the dark I could barely see, but I swore I caught the faint outline of a figure near the corner. The longer I looked, the less sure I was, but the sense of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl. I reached over and flicked on the bedside lamp. The room snapped into light. No one there. Nothing but the chair in the corner, a folded quilt draped over it. My pulse was hammering. I told myself it was a dream and forced myself back under the covers, but I didn't sleep again. The next morning at breakfast, Angela looked more tired than ever. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. "You didn't sleep well, did you?" she asked suddenly, not looking at me. I froze. What makes you say that? She glanced up then, her eyes unreadable. No one sleeps well in that room. Mark shot her a look, and she went quiet, focusing on her plate. I didn't know what to say, so I just muttered something about being in a new place. But her words stuck with me all day while we worked on fixing the back steps and clearing some brush. That evening, Lily wandered onto the porch while I was sitting there alone. She climbed into the rocking chair and stared out at the woods. "Do you see her too?" she asked softly, almost like she was talking to herself. "See who?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "The lady in your room," she said, swinging her legs. "She stands by the bed. She doesn't like it when people sleep in there." Then she hopped down and went back inside before I could ask another question. I told myself kids make things up, repeat things they overhear. But that night I dreaded going back upstairs. I left the lamp on, determined to ignore any noises. For hours, the house seemed quiet. But around 2 in the morning, a sharp knock jolted me awake. 3 knocks, deliberate, on the door to the room. My throat went dry. I forced myself to say, "Mark," but there was no answer. I sat frozen, staring at the door. Slowly, the knob rattled like someone trying it. My heart slammed in my chest. Then it stopped. I didn't move until daylight filtered in through the curtains. At breakfast, I tried to mention it casually, but Angela's fork clattered against her plate. She looked at Mark, who just shook his head. "It's fine," he said quickly. "Old house, draft makes doors move." But I knew he was lying. His eyes were too sharp, too warning. Later, while Angela was out with Lily, I cornered him in the barn. "What the hell is going on here, Mark? That wasn't a draft last night." He rubbed his face, looking torn. Finally, he said, "There's stories in Angie's family about a woman who lived here a long time ago. Her name was Margaret. She was Angela's great-great-aunt or something. Never married, lived in that room until she died. They say she was strange, into things she shouldn't have been, and when she passed, she never really left." He paused, lowering his voice. "Angie hears her sometimes, humming, crying, always around that room." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, but another part, the part that had heard breathing in the dark, the knocks, the rattling knob, knew he was telling the truth. That night, I offered to sleep on the couch downstairs. Angela didn't argue. Around midnight, I woke again. Not to breathing this time, but to movement. A shadow passed along the wall opposite me, crossing in front of the window, though the blinds were drawn shut. My body went cold. I sat up, watching. The shadow moved again, slower, almost gliding. The air in the room grew colder, prickling my skin. And then I heard it. A woman's voice, low and broken, whispering words I couldn't make out. I wanted to bolt upstairs, wake Mark, but I was rooted in place, heart pounding so loud I thought it might drown her out. The whispering grew sharper, closer. Then the rocking chair on the porch creaked once, twice. I forced myself to the window, yanked the blinds. The porch was empty. Still, the chair moved back and forth, slow and deliberate, like someone unseen sat there watching. By morning, I was pale and shaking. Angela barely spoke, but when our eyes met, I saw she knew exactly what I had experienced. She pressed her lips together and said, "She doesn't want you here." I left that afternoon earlier than planned. I didn't tell Mark or Angela the full extent of what I'd seen, but they didn't ask. On the drive back, the road seemed endless, the woods pressing close. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat. That night in my own apartment, I should have felt relief. But as I lay in bed, just starting to drift, a faint creak came from the corner of my room. My chair, empty, shifted almost imperceptibly. I sat bolt upright, heart slamming. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination dragging pieces of the farmhouse back with me. But even now, years later, sometimes when I can't sleep, I hear that faint rhythm of breathing in the dark, just beside me, reminding me that whatever haunted those sleepless nights didn't stay behind completely. Story the end. It was one of those summer nights where the air seemed too heavy to breathe, and sleep felt like an impossible task. The small town in northern Pennsylvania where I grew up had a way of turning utterly quiet once the sun went down, and the silence always seemed to magnify the smallest sounds. Crickets and cicadas hummed in the trees, an occasional car rumbled past on the distant 2-lane road, and every once in a while you could hear a dog bark faintly from across the valley. My parents' house sat at the edge of a patch of woods, and beyond that, rolling hills stretched into darker, denser forests. I had come home for a week from college, trying to get away from stress, but instead, I ended up in the middle of a night that I still struggle to explain, even years later. The house itself wasn't particularly old, built in the mid-70s, just a typical ranch-style home with wood paneling inside and a long porch that overlooked the yard. Nothing about it felt creepy to me as a kid, but that night, the atmosphere was different. I was sleeping in my old bedroom, which faced the woods, and I remember lying in bed with the window cracked open because the room was too warm. The curtain fluttered in the occasional breeze, but most of the air that came in was still and humid. I had been staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours, watching shadows shift in the corners of the room when I first noticed something strange. It was around 2:30 in the morning when I heard it, a faint tapping sound against the glass of the window. At first I thought it was a moth or some other insect, but the tapping was too deliberate. 3 slow, spaced-out taps. Then, silence. I froze, straining my ears. The woods were alive with the sounds of insects, but everything near the house seemed suddenly too quiet. After a minute, I convinced myself it had been a branch brushing against the window. I even leaned up to check, pulling the curtain back slightly. Nothing. The nearest tree was at least 10 feet away, and there wasn't any branch long enough to hit the glass. I let the curtain fall and tried to calm myself down, but then it came again. 3 taps. Slow. Measured. My pulse quickened, and I found myself staring at the dark outline of the window, half expecting a face to appear. I told myself it had to be a bird or some other animal, though what kind of animal knocks in perfect rhythm at nearly 3 in the morning? I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 2:37. My heart was racing, but I tried to ignore it, rolled over and pulled the blanket over my head. I must have dozed off for a little while, because the next thing I remember was waking with a start to a sound that chilled me. This time it wasn't tapping, it was whispering. The kind of sound that isn't clear words, just the rhythm of speech, low and hushed. It seemed to come from just outside the window, and my stomach turned to ice as I realized I could hear it even with the window mostly closed. I sat up slowly, barely breathing, straining to catch any words. For a few seconds I thought I heard my name, drawn out in a voice that wasn't familiar, almost a hiss. I scrambled for my phone again and shined the flashlight toward the window. Nothing was there, just the curtain fluttering in the faint breeze. I debated waking my parents, but I didn't want to sound crazy. I kept the light on for a while, sitting up in bed, trying to convince myself I had just imagined it. Maybe I was overtired, maybe the sound had been wind or animals. Eventually, the exhaustion won, and I lay back down with the phone clutched in my hand. Sleep didn't come easy, though, and I found myself staring again at the shifting shadows. Sometime later, maybe an hour, maybe less, I woke up again, but this time not to sound. It was the sensation that something was in the room with me, that heavy, pressing feeling of being watched. I didn't move at first. My breath came shallow, and I focused on the darkness in the corner of the room near my closet. There was a shape there, taller than the dresser, darker than the rest of the shadows. It didn't move, but I knew, deep in my gut, that it wasn't supposed to be there. My mouth went dry, and every instinct told me not to look directly at it. But I couldn't help it. I kept flicking my eyes back to the corner, hoping it would vanish when I focused on it. It didn't. Finally, I mustered the courage to shine my phone's flashlight toward the corner. The moment the light hit, the shape was gone. Just the closet door, slightly ajar like always. My chest was tight, and I told myself I was just scaring myself, just overtired. But as I lowered the light, I swore I saw something flicker across the room, a movement too quick to be explained. That was when I heard my bedroom door creak. I snapped the flashlight toward it. The door was shut, just like I remembered. But the sound had been real. I knew I hadn't imagined that. I sat frozen, clutching the phone, ears straining for any other noise. My parents' room was down the hall. Maybe one of them had gotten up to use the bathroom. But then I realized I hadn't heard footsteps, just the creak of the door. Nothing else. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay awake until the sky began to pale with early dawn, my body tense, every sound magnified. When the sun finally rose, the house seemed normal again. My mom was making coffee, my dad reading the paper. I sat at the kitchen table, pale and exhausted, and debated telling them what happened. But I didn't. I didn't want them to brush it off as a bad dream or stress. That day, I tried to forget about it. I went into town, met up with an old friend, and spent most of the afternoon out of the house. By the time evening came, I had almost convinced myself that the whole night had been in my head. But when darkness fell again, and I lay back in that same bed, the unease returned. The woods outside seemed louder, the shadows deeper. I tried to sleep, telling myself over and over that it was just imagination. But around 3 a.m., it started again. This time, it wasn't tapping. It was scratching. Slow, deliberate scratches against the glass of my window. My entire body tensed, and I sat up, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't want to look, but I forced myself to glance at the window. The curtain moved slightly, but I couldn't see anything beyond it. The sound came again. Scratch. Scratch. Like fingernails dragging across the pane. I grabbed my phone and dialed my dad's number, even though he was just down the hall. He answered groggily, and I whispered that something was at my window. He told me to stay put, and a minute later, I heard him coming down the hall. He opened my door, turned on the light, and walked straight to the window. He yanked the curtain open. Nothing was there. He even went outside with a flashlight, circling the house. Still nothing. He came back in, gave me a look that was a mix of concern and mild annoyance, and told me it was probably just branches or maybe a raccoon. I didn't argue, but deep down I knew what I had heard. Those sounds weren't random. They were deliberate. The following nights only got worse. The whispering returned, always around the same time. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther, like more than one voice moving through the yard. One night, I swore I heard footsteps circling the house, like crunching lightly on the gravel drive. I stayed frozen in bed, listening as the steps paused beneath my window, then slowly moved away. Another night, I woke to find the closet door wide open, even though I remembered shutting it. And once, just before dawn, I jolted awake to the sensation of cold breath on my face, though when I opened my eyes, I was alone. By the fourth night, I was barely holding it together. My parents noticed I was pale, jittery, drinking too much coffee. I finally told my mom what was happening, expecting her to dismiss it. To my surprise, she went quiet and said she'd heard strange things too, years ago, but never talked about it. She mentioned hearing voices outside her window when I was little, or footsteps in the hall when everyone was asleep. My dad never believed her, so she had kept it to herself. That only made my skin crawl more. It wasn't just me. Something had always been there. The final night I spent in that house was the worst. I woke up around 3:15, the same time as always, to a sound that froze me to my core. It was the bedroom door opening. Slowly, the hinges groaned, and I could see the faint outline of the door shifting in the dark. My phone was on the nightstand, but I couldn't move to grab it. I just lay there, heart pounding so hard it hurt, staring at the door as it crept wider and wider. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard the floorboards creak. Soft, careful footsteps entering the room. My mouth went dry. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel it. Something was there. Something was standing by my bed. The air turned ice cold, and I felt pressure against the mattress, like someone leaning down. Then right by my ear, I heard it. A whisper, clear this time, in a voice that wasn't male or female, just a low rasp that made every hair on my body stand up. You can't leave. I bolted upright, fumbling for the light. The moment it flicked on, the room was empty. The door stood wide open. My chest heaved, and I knew I couldn't stay another night in that house. The next morning, I packed up my things and cut my visit short, telling my parents I needed to get back early for school. I never told them exactly what happened that last night, only that I couldn't sleep there anymore. Years later, I still have nights where I wake up at 3:15, heart racing, convinced something is in the room with me. I've lived in different apartments, different cities, but that feeling follows me sometimes, slipping into my sleep. I still hear the whisper in my head, that warning, that threat, and I wonder if maybe in some way I never really left. Story the end. The first time it happened, I thought it was just the usual creaks of the house, the kind of noises anyone with an old place would get used to. The house I was staying in wasn't mine. It belonged to my aunt-uncle in upstate New York, a quiet countryside town where the nights were darker than I'd ever experienced. I had been sent there for a few weeks during the summer after my college semester ended to help them with some chores, and because they didn't want the house sitting empty while they went on a long trip to see relatives out west. The house itself sat at the end of a long gravel driveway that cut through a dense patch of woods. It was 2 stories, white painted wood with shutters that hadn't been opened in years. My aunt had warned me that the place could feel a little too quiet, but I brushed that off. I was used to city life, so I figured a few quiet nights might be good for me. The first couple of days were peaceful. I'd mow the lawn, water her plants, and check the mail. At night, I'd sit in the living room, flipping through their old collection of DVDs. I slept in the guest room upstairs, a space that smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. I kept a small lamp on most nights, because once I turned it off, the room was swallowed in a heavy kind of darkness. The first odd thing happened on my third night. I'd been lying in bed, not quite asleep, when I heard footsteps above me. That shouldn't have been possible. The guest room was on the top floor. At first, I told myself it might be the house shifting, but it didn't sound like wood popping or wind pressing against the walls. It was rhythmic, steady, like someone walking slowly from one end of the attic to the other. I lay there, my body stiff under the blanket, listening as the steps paused directly above me. Then, after a silence that stretched on too long, the sound started again, retreating back across the ceiling until it faded completely. I told myself the attic must have had mice or maybe raccoons. That thought made it easier to sleep. But the next night, the footsteps returned. Same time, same pattern. I was tired from doing yard work all day, so I pressed a pillow over my ears and eventually drifted off. On the fifth night, something happened that I couldn't brush off. I woke up around 2:30 a.m., the kind of waking where you don't know why your eyes suddenly snap open. The lamp was still on, and the room looked just as I had left it. But the air felt heavy, like I was being watched. I tried to convince myself I was just spooked when the doorknob to my room rattled. Not just once. Someone turned it firmly, like they were trying to open the door. My heart slammed into my throat. I sat up in bed, staring at the knob as it twitched and shook. I thought maybe one of my aunt's neighbors had wandered in somehow, but the nearest house was a mile away, and I had locked every door downstairs before bed. After maybe 10 seconds, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I waited, staring, until eventually exhaustion pulled me back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I checked the lock. It worked fine. Nothing was broken. I even looked outside, kept circling the house to see if there were footprints in the dew-soaked grass, but there was nothing. That night, I kept the lamp on and a heavy chair pushed against the door. I told myself I wouldn't scare so easily this time. But the footsteps came back. This time, they weren't just above me. They started in the attic, then slowly descended the staircase that led to the second floor. I could hear each groan of the wood, each pause between steps. When the sound reached the hallway outside my room, the chair against my door gave a faint scrape, as though something on the other side had nudged it. I held my breath, clutching my phone in one hand, debating whether to call someone. But who? My aunt and uncle were across the country. Calling the police would sound ridiculous. "Hi, officer. Someone might be in my house, but I don't actually know, and nothing's broken." I stayed like that for hours, too afraid to sleep, until the first gray light of morning filtered through the curtains. When I finally opened the door, the chair was still in place, untouched. The following day, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had dreamed it all. Stress and exhaustion could play tricks on anyone. But deep down, I knew it hadn't been a dream. The sleepless nights piled up. I'd lie in bed, forcing myself to keep my eyes open, listening for every sound. The footsteps became a routine, always starting in the attic, always moving down the stairs, always stopping just outside my room. Sometimes I thought I could hear faint breathing through the door. Once I swore I heard a whisper, but I couldn't make out words. By the 10th night, I was at my breaking point. I thought about leaving early, but I'd promised my aunt and uncle I'd stay until they returned. Besides, leaving would feel like admitting I was scared, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who ran from shadows. That night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I stayed downstairs in the living room until after midnight, sitting on the couch with all the lights on. At first, nothing happened. The house was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of crickets outside. I started to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, until I heard the faint creak of the attic door upstairs opening. I froze. My eyes fixed on the staircase that led to the second floor. Slowly, almost deliberately, footsteps descended one by one, but there was nothing visible on the stairs, just the sound, heavy and real, moving closer. By the time it reached the bottom step, I was shaking so hard I could barely breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The sound paused, as though whoever or whatever it was had stopped just out of sight. The living room light flickered once, twice, then steadied. I whispered out loud, "Who's there?" My voice cracked. There was no reply, just silence. Then, after a few seconds, the footsteps resumed, crossing the hardwood floor toward me. My body screamed to move, but I sat frozen as the invisible steps circled the couch. The cushion beside me dipped slightly, like someone had just sat down. That broke me. I bolted, running out the front door barefoot, down the gravel driveway until my lungs burned. I didn't stop until I reached the road, standing there in the dark, gasping, staring back at the silent house. Eventually, I forced myself back inside just as the sun was rising. I didn't want to explain to my aunt and uncle why I had abandoned their house, but after that, I never sat in the living room at night again. I locked myself in the guest room, lights blazing, chair against the door. I slept in short bursts, never fully letting go. On my final night, I thought maybe the worst was over. It was around 3 a.m., and I'd managed to doze off. Then I woke to find the lamp flickering wildly, the shadows in the room stretching and twisting. I sat up, and for the first time, I wasn't alone. In the corner, by the closet, stood a figure. It wasn't solid, more like a shape made of smoke and darkness, but it had form. A head, shoulders, arms that hung unnaturally long. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My whole body was locked in place. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, like it was struggling to control its own limbs. The room grew colder with each step. When it reached the foot of my bed, it stopped. Then, slowly, it leaned forward, its face hovering inches from mine. The air was icy, and I swear I felt breath against my skin. A whisper filled my ear, low and drawn out. "Stay." The lamp blew out, plunging the room into total darkness. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke, sunlight filled the room. The lamp was shattered on the floor, the bulb in pieces. The chair was no longer against the door. It was in the middle of the room. My body ached as though I'd been held down all night. I left that morning without looking back. I didn't even bother making the bed. When my aunt and uncle returned a week later, they called to thank me for watching the house. I didn't tell them what had happened. I just said everything had gone fine. But I haven't slept through the night since. Even back in my own apartment, I wake up at 3 a.m. sharp every single night, and sometimes in the corner of my room, I think I see the faint outline of something standing there, waiting. Story the end.